There are depths beneath Mars that have never known the light of binary suns. In the year 999 of the 40th millennium, when the Imperium stood balanced on the knife edge of its greatest trials, these forgotten places still kept their secrets. The red planet's surface bore the scars of 10,000 years of industry and war. Yet beneath its rust-colored skin lay chambers older than the throne of terror itself. Magos Explorator, Zeth Aleph, descended through the ancient elevator shaft with the mechanical precision of one who had done so countless times before. His augmented limbs moved with fluid grace, each servo responding to neural commands faster than biological thought. The crimson robes of his office rustled against the reinforced walls as the platform carried him deeper into the bowels of Mars, 15 kilometers down through the Noctis Labyrinthus, where the very stone remembered the wars of the Age of Strife. The air grew thicker with each meter of descent, heavy with the incense of blessed oils and the ozone scent of active machinery. Tech servitors flanked him on either side, their vacant eyes glowing with the pale light of their cogitators. These were not the crude automata used in the upper levels, but precision instruments crafted for the delicate work of deep exploration. Each bore the sacred marks of the Omnissiah, their flesh blessed and their machine spirits properly appeased. Zeth Aleph's vox grill crackled with static as they reached the survey depth. His enhanced vocal cords shaped the words with mechanical precision. Survey Team Secundus, begin standard protocols. The machine god watches our endeavors. The response came immediately from the team below, a chorus of binary cant that confirmed their readiness. Today would mark the 2,847th deep survey conducted in this sector of the Noctis Labyrinthus. Routine had made it predictable. Routine had made it safe. The platform shuddered to a halt at Survey Station Sigma 7, a reinforced chamber carved from living rock and lined with blessed adamantine. Here the walls gleamed with the light of plasma conduits, their energy flowing through circuits that had hummed with power since before the heresy itself. Zeth Aleph stepped onto the metal grating, his augmetic legs adjusting automatically to the slight gravitational variance this far beneath the surface. The machine god's domain stretched endlessly in all directions, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that had been mapped and remapped for millennia. Tech Adept Gamma 9 approached with the ritual deference owed to a Magos explorator. Her servo-skull bobbed alongside her, its sensors scanning Zeth Aleph's blessed form for any signs of corruption or malfunction. Honored Magos, the deep core penetrator has achieved optimal depth. We stand ready to initiate the blessed work. Her words carried the slight mechanical distortion common to those who had undergone extensive vocal modification. She had served in the deep surveys for 3 decades, her augmentations specifically calibrated for the pressures and radiation levels found in Mars's deepest places. Zeth Aleph's optical sensors swept across the chamber's displays, each one showing the familiar patterns of geological survey data. Temperature readings, seismic activity, atmospheric composition, all within expected parameters for this depth and region. The Noctis Labyrinthus had been thoroughly mapped in the upper levels, its maze of canyons and valleys well documented by generations of tech priests. Yet it was in the deep places that the greatest secrets were found, where the ancient builders of Mars had delved into the planet's core, seeking knowledge that now belonged to the machine god alone. The survey began with the ritual invocations, each tech adept speaking the proper canticles to awaken the machine spirits of their instruments. Seismic charges were placed with reverent care, their explosive force calibrated to penetrate the deepest stone without damaging the sacred networks that ran through Mars like arteries of steel. Zeth Aleph watched as his subordinates worked, their movements coordinated with the precision that came from decades of shared labor. This was the 41st millennium, but the rituals they followed were older than the imperium itself. The first charges detonated with a sound like distant thunder, their shock waves radiating outward through the planet's crust. Seismic sensors scattered throughout the deep levels registered the vibrations, translating them into the complex patterns of data that would reveal what lay hidden beneath their feet. For long minutes, the only sound was the soft humming of processors working to decode the information, their machine spirits laboring to transform raw sensation into blessed knowledge. Then Gamma 9's voice cut through the chamber's quiet concentration, tight with something that might have been confusion. "Honored Magos, we are detecting structural anomalies at depth marker 17.4 kilometers. Her servo skull darted closer to the primary display, its sensors confirming what the larger instruments had found. The seismic patterns showed something that should not have been there, geometric forms that spoke of construction rather than natural formation. Zeth Aleph moved to the display with swift, mechanical strides. His enhanced cognitive systems absorbed the data in milliseconds, processing patterns that would have taken an unaugmented mind hours to comprehend. What he saw defied the established geological surveys of this region. The seismic echoes revealed chambers vast beyond current mapping, their walls too regular to be natural, their angles too precise to be the work of Martian colonial expansion. These structures were old, perhaps older than the first human footsteps on Mars's surface. "Initiate secondary sweep," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority that came with his rank and the blessed modifications that enhanced it. "Full spectrum analysis. The machine god reveals his mysteries to those who serve with proper devotion." Yet even as he spoke the ritual words, Zeth Aleph's cognitive systems were already calculating probabilities and implications. The anomalies were located deeper than any known construction, in regions that predated even the earliest surveys of the Mechanicum. The second wave of charges erupted through the deep stone, their energy directed with surgical precision toward the anomalous regions. This time, the seismic returns painted a picture that sent involuntary electrical discharges through Zeth Aleph's neural networks. The chambers below were not merely large, they were vast, their dimensions suggesting construction on a scale that rivaled the greatest works of the Mechanicum. Corridors stretched for kilometers in perfect geometric patterns, their walls rising to heights that defied conventional engineering. Tech adept Gamma 9's augmented features betrayed no emotion, but her servo skull's sensors detected elevated stress patterns in her biological components. "Magos, the architectural analysis suggests construction techniques unknown to current forge protocols. The engineering principles—" Her words trailed off as new data cascaded across the displays, revealing details that challenged everything they thought they knew about Mars's hidden depths. It was then that the first tremor came, not from their own seismic charges, but from something else entirely. The tremor carried a rhythm, a pattern that spoke not of geological activity, but of something far more deliberate. Zeth Aleph's acoustic sensors registered the vibration's frequency and duration, his analytical systems immediately noting its artificial nature. This was not the random shifting of stone or metal, but something that carried the unmistakable signature of purpose. The second tremor followed exactly 4.7 seconds later, identical in frequency and duration. Then a third, and a fourth, each one precisely timed, each one carrying the same inexplicable rhythm. Zeth Aleph's servo skull descended from its hovering position, its specialized sensors working to isolate and analyze the phenomenon. What it found sent warning runes cascading across every display in the chamber. The tremors were coming from a depth of 18.3 kilometers, far below their current position, far below any known structure or excavation. They followed a pattern that Zeth Aleph's cognitive systems recognized as binary code, each tremor corresponding to a specific data value. Someone, or something, was transmitting from the deepest reaches of Mars. The message was simple, repeated over and over with mechanical precision. A countdown. A countdown that, according to his calculations, had been running for exactly 10,000 years. Tech Adept Gamma 9 stepped closer to the primary display, her optical sensors focusing on the seismic data with enhanced magnification. Honored Magos, permission to speak freely. Her voice carried the slight distortion that indicated elevated stress responses in her remaining biological components. Zeth Aleph granted permission with a gesture, his attention still focused on the impossible data streaming across his consciousness. In my 30 years of deep survey work, I have never encountered anything like this. The source appears to be artificial, but the depth, nothing was built that deep. Not during the colonial period, not during the Mechanicum's expansion, not even during the blessed founding of our order. She paused, her cognitive systems processing implications that her training had never prepared her for. Whatever is down there was here before we came to Mars. Zeth Aleph's mechanical fingers danced across the control interfaces, commanding additional sensors to focus on the source of the transmissions. Each new scan revealed more disturbing details. The signal originated from a chamber of immense size, its dimensions suggesting architecture on a scale that dwarfed even the greatest forge complexes of Mars. More troubling still, the chamber appeared to be sealed, its walls showing no signs of the wear and damage that would be expected from 10 millennia of geological activity. The tremors continued with mechanical precision, their countdown marking time in a sequence that Zeth Aleph's enhanced cognition could follow, but not fully comprehend. Each pulse carried data, layers of information encoded in seismic vibrations that spoke of technologies beyond current understanding. This was not the crude signaling of ancient emergency beacons or the random activation of forgotten systems. This was communication, deliberate and purposeful, transmitted from depths that should have held only stone and darkness. "Initiate full survey lockdown," Zeth Aleph commanded, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of service to the machine god. "No data leaves this chamber without my direct authorization. No communications beyond this level without proper encryption and authentication." The implications of their discovery were beginning to crystallize in his enhanced consciousness, possibilities that threatened the very foundations of Mechanicum orthodoxy. As the survey team worked to secure their equipment and data, Zeth Aleph found himself staring at the displays with a mixture of excitement and growing apprehension. In his long service to the Omnissiah, he had uncovered many secrets hidden in the depths of Mars. Ancient archives, forgotten technologies, relics of the blessed age of technology, all had yielded their mysteries to proper investigation and reverent study. But this was different. This was not the remnant of human achievement, but something that predated humanity's arrival on Mars itself. The countdown continued, each pulse marking another step toward some unknown culmination. Zeth Aleph's analytical systems calculated that, at its current rate, the sequence would reach completion in less than 1 Terran year. Whatever had been waiting in the depths of Mars for 10,000 years, its patience was finally coming to an end. And Magos Explorator Zeth Aleph, servant of the machine, god and guardian of sacred knowledge, found himself standing at the threshold of a discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about the red planet that had been humanity's faithful companion since the dawn of interstellar expansion. The machine. God's mysteries were vast and eternal, but some secrets Zeth Aleph was beginning to suspect were meant to remain hidden in the depths, where even the blessed light of knowledge could not reach. Yet the tremors continued, each one carrying its message from the darkness below, each one bringing whatever lay, waiting in those impossible depths, one step closer to the end of its ancient vigil. The crimson spires of the Fabricator General's sanctum rose above the Martian landscape, like monuments to mankind's dominion over the machine god's domain. Within the highest tower, where the blessed atmosphere recyclers hummed with ancient purpose, Fabricator General Kane received the sealed data packet with the ceremonial gravity befitting such communications. His augmented form, more machine than flesh after 8 centuries of blessed modification, processed the encryption protocols with mechanical precision. Yet nothing in his vast experience had prepared him for what the deep survey had uncovered. Kane's optical sensors swept across the transmitted data with the speed of pure cognition. Each line of seismic analysis, each fragment of architectural measurement, each rhythmic pulse recorded by Zeth Aleph's instruments painted a picture that challenged the very foundations of Mechanicum orthodoxy. His enhanced neural networks fired warning runes across his consciousness as the implications became clear. This was not merely another archaeological curiosity buried in Mars's depths, but something that threatened to unravel 10,000 years of carefully maintained doctrine. The sealed chamber that housed the Fabricator General's most sensitive deliberations bore the scars of countless momentous decisions. Here, during the dark days of the schism of Mars, the loyalist tech priests had planned their resistance to Horus's corruption. Here, in the aftermath of the heresy, the survivors had sworn new oaths of fealty to the Golden Throne. Now, as Kane studied the impossible data from the deep surveys, he sensed that another such moment of crisis was upon them. Tech Dominus Vex entered the sanctum with the measured steps of one who had served at the highest levels of the Mechanicum hierarchy for 3 centuries. His augmented form bore the ritual scarification that marked him as a keeper of the most sacred mysteries, his neural implants modified to contain and process information too dangerous for lesser minds. Kane had summoned him not merely for his expertise in xenoarchaeology, but for his absolute loyalty to the Omnissiah and his proven ability to maintain the silence that some knowledge demanded. Fabricator General, Vex intoned, his vox grill shaped by decades of ritual modification to produce the precise harmonic frequencies that marked formal address. I have reviewed the preliminary data as commanded. The implications are... He paused, his cognitive systems struggling to find words adequate to the magnitude of what they faced. Disturbing beyond conventional parameters. Kane's mechanical digits danced across the hololithic display interfaces, calling up the seismic analyses in their full, terrible detail. The chamber buried 18 kilometers beneath the Noctis. Labyrinthus appeared before them in ghostly outline, its dimensions so vast that even their enhanced cognition struggled to process its scale. The walls showed signs of construction techniques that predated any known human technology, their angles and proportions speaking of engineering principles that remained beyond current understanding. The material composition defies analysis, Vex continued, his servo skull drifting closer to the display to focus its specialized sensors on the structural data. Our deep core samplers have encountered barriers that resist molecular-level examination. The substance appears to be neither metal nor stone, but something that exists in a state between matter and energy. The blessed rights of material identification return only error codes and contradiction protocols. Kane's enhanced auditory sensors registered the subtle harmonic distortions in Vex's voice that indicated elevated stress responses in his remaining biological components. In 3 centuries of service to the machine god, the Tech Dominus had encountered relics and mysteries that would have driven unaugmented minds to madness. Yet this discovery had shaken even his mechanically augmented certainties. The Fabricator General activated additional security protocols, sealing the chamber against any form of electronic surveillance or data transmission. What they discussed in the coming hours would determine not merely the fate of their expedition, but potentially the stability of the Mechanicum itself. "Show me the pattern analysis," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute rank and the weight of terrible knowledge. Vex's mechanical fingers interfaced directly with the display systems, his neural implants translating raw data into comprehensible patterns. The rhythmic pulses detected by the deep survey resolved into binary sequences, each tremor corresponding to specific data values that formed a coherent mathematical progression. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications, a countdown sequence that had been running with mechanical precision for exactly 10,000 years. The transmission began in the final year of the Horus heresy, Vex reported, his analytical systems cross-referencing the pattern against historical chronometers. The initial pulse coincides with the Emperor's enthronement upon the Golden Throne. Since that moment, the sequence has continued without deviation, marking each Terran year with mathematical exactitude. At current progression rates, the countdown will reach completion in 11 Terran months, 4 days, and 17 hours. Kane's cognitive processes absorbed the information with the terrible clarity that came from complete neural enhancement. The implications cascaded through his consciousness like falling dominoes, each revelation spawning a dozen new questions that threatened to undermine everything the Mechanicum claimed to know about Mars and its hidden depths. If something had been imprisoned beneath their sacred world since before the heresy, if it had been counting down the years until the Emperor's weakening grip on life finally failed, then the very foundations of their faith were built upon deliberate ignorance. The Fabricator General moved to the chamber's most secure terminal, one whose machine spirit had been blessed by the Omnissiah himself, and whose data cores were shielded by sacred algorithms older than the Imperium. Here were stored the deepest secrets of the Mechanicum, knowledge so dangerous that even amongst the tech priests, only the most senior were permitted access. His augmented fingers danced across interfaces that responded to genetic codes, neural patterns, and sacred mathematical sequences known only to those who had sworn the most binding oaths of secrecy. What Kane accessed in that moment was a fragment of knowledge that the Mechanicum had guarded for 10 millennia, a secret so profound that it had shaped their entire relationship with the Imperium. Deep beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, in chambers sealed since before the Age of Strife, lay something that the first tech priests had called the Dragon of Mars. The official records spoke of it as a dormant machine spirit of immense power, a remnant of the dark age of technology that required constant vigilance to maintain its slumber. Yet the true records, accessible only to the Fabricator General and his most trusted advisors, revealed a darker truth. The dragon was no mere machine, but something older and more terrible than human technology. The Emperor himself had placed it in its prison, binding it with psychic wards and technological seals that had held for millennia. The Mechanicum's role was not merely to study and preserve ancient knowledge, but to serve as jailers for something that could threaten the very existence of human civilization. Tec Dominus Vex, Kane said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority and terrible knowledge. What I'm about to share with you is protected by the most sacred oaths of our order. The penalty for revealing this knowledge to any unauthorized person is not merely excommunication, but complete neural erasure and biological dissolution. Vex acknowledged with the ritual genuflection that such pronouncements demanded, his augmented form assuming the posture of absolute submission to higher authority. The entity you have designated as the source of these transmissions is not unknown to us. For 10,000 years, the Mechanicum has maintained watch over something imprisoned in the deepest vaults of Mars. We have called it the Dragon, and our most sacred duty has been to ensure its continued slumber. The countdown you have detected suggests that this vigil may be approaching its end. Vex's optical sensors focused with enhanced magnification on the data displays, his cognitive systems processing the implications with mechanical precision. If the dragon stirs, if the bonds that hold it begin to weaken. His words trailed off as his analytical processes calculated the potential consequences of such an event. The destruction of Mars would be merely the beginning. An awakened dragon could threaten Terra itself, could undermine the very foundations upon which the Imperium was built. Kane's enhanced form moved with mechanical grace to the chamber's communication arrays, systems so heavily shielded and encrypted that even the Inquisition's most sophisticated surveillance could not penetrate their security. What he was about to initiate had not been done since the dark days of the Schism, when the very survival of the Mechanicum had hung in the balance. He was calling together the Conclave of Iron, the secret assembly of the most senior tech priests, whose existence was known only to a handful of individuals across the galaxy. "I am transmitting authorization codes to the Grand Magi of the 7 greatest Forge worlds," Kane announced, his fingers dancing across controls that responded to biometric signatures and sacred mathematical algorithms. Each will receive a fragment of the data, sufficient to understand the magnitude of our situation, but insufficient to act independently. Within 72 hours they will gather here in the deepest vaults of Mars to decide our course of action. The implications of such a gathering were staggering. For the Grand Magi to abandon their Forge worlds simultaneously would be noticed by Imperial authorities, by Inquisition observers, by the countless intelligence networks that monitored the Mechanicum's activities. Questions would be asked, investigations launched, and the ancient compact between Mars and Terra might be strained to its breaking point. Yet Kane knew that some threats transcended even the carefully maintained balance of Imperial politics. Vex's servo-skull descended to hover at eye level, its sensors focused on the Fabricator General with enhanced magnification. The risk of exposure is significant. If word of this gathering reaches Imperial intelligence, if the Inquisition begins to ask questions about our activities in the deep vaults, his cognitive systems calculated probability matrices that painted increasingly dire scenarios of Imperial intervention and Mechanicum dissolution. "The risk of inaction is greater," Kane replied, his vox grills shaped by centuries of modification to convey absolute certainty. "If the countdown reaches completion, if the dragon awakens without preparation on our part, then Mars dies. And with Mars dies the Mechanicum, the Imperium's technological foundation, and perhaps humanity's last hope of surviving in a galaxy that grows more hostile with each passing year." The chamber fell silent, except for the soft humming of processing units and the distant thunder of plasma reactors that powered the Forge complexes above. Kane and Vex stood surrounded by displays showing impossible architecture and incomprehensible materials, evidence of something that challenged everything they thought they knew about Mars and its hidden depths. The countdown continued with mechanical precision, each pulse bringing them closer to a moment that would determine the fate of worlds. In the depths below, something older than the Imperium continued its patient vigil, counting down the moments until the bonds that held it would weaken enough to permit its liberation. The Dragon of Mars stirred in dreams that spanned millennia, and in the deepest vaults of the Mechanicum, the guardians of ancient secrets prepared for a crisis that would test the very foundations of their faith. The blessed certainties of 10,000 years were crumbling, and in their place rose questions that threatened to consume everything in the fires of forbidden knowledge. The machine. God's mysteries were vast and eternal, but some truths, Kane was beginning to understand, were meant to remain hidden even from his most faithful servants. Yet the countdown would not be stopped by prayer or ritual, and the time for comfortable ignorance was rapidly drawing to a close. In 11 months, the ancient vigil would end, and the Mechanicum would face a test that would determine whether they were worthy guardians of the galaxy's most terrible secret. In the deepest chambers of the Noctis Labyrinthus, where the red dust of Mars had never fallen, and the light of binary suns was only a memory, Dahlia Sithra felt the first tremors of something that should not have been possible. For 10,000 years she had maintained her vigil, watching over the imprisonment of the entity, known as the Dragon of Mars. Her enhanced senses, honed by millennia of proximity to one of the galaxy's most dangerous beings, registered disturbances in the psychic emanations that surrounded the creature's prison. Yet these new vibrations came not from the dragon itself, but from somewhere deeper still. The Guardian Sanctum lay carved from living rock, 20 kilometers beneath the surface, its walls lined with hexagrammic wards and psychic dampeners that had been inscribed by the Emperor's own hand. Here, in chambers that existed outside the normal flow of time and space, Cythera had spent centuries in meditation and watchfulness, her consciousness permanently attuned to the slightest fluctuation in the dragon's psychic signature. She had felt its dreams, witnessed its nightmares, and endured the constant pressure of its sleeping malevolence. But never before had she sensed the stirring of something that lay even deeper than her ancient charge. Romu 31 emerged from the equipment alcove where he had been conducting the ritual maintenance of the containment systems. The ancient Mechanicum protector moved with the fluid grace of perfect engineering, his form a blend of blessed machinery and sanctified ceramite that had endured since the dark days of the schism. His optical sensors focused on Cythera with enhanced magnification, detecting the elevated stress patterns that marked her growing concern. "Guardian," he intoned, his vox grill shaped by millennia of service to produce the precise harmonic frequencies that would not disturb the delicate psychic balance of their sanctum. The containment matrices show unusual fluctuations. The dragon's neural activity has increased by 12% in the past solar hour. This variance exceeds normal parameters by significant margins. Cythera rose from her meditation throne, her movements carrying the unconscious grace of one who had been granted unnaturally extended life. The Emperor's gift of perpetual existence had not changed her fundamental humanity, but millennia of proximity to the dragon had altered her in ways that even she did not fully understand. Her psychic senses had become attuned to frequencies beyond normal human perception, allowing her to monitor the dragon's condition with an intimacy that bordered on uncomfortable. "It is not the dragon that disturbs the balance," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty earned through 10,000 years of constant vigilance. "Something else stirs in the deep places, something that calls to the creature we guard. I can feel its response, the way a caged predator responds to the scent of approaching prey or rival." Her enhanced senses reached out through the labyrinthine passages that surrounded their sanctum, seeking the source of the disturbance that had awakened such unprecedented reaction in their ancient charge. Romu 31's servo skull descended from its hovering position, its specialized sensors working to analyze the energy readings that cascaded across the sanctum's monitoring systems. The data painted a picture that challenged his extensive understanding of the containment protocols. Seismic vibrations were emanating from depths that should have held only stone and darkness, carried by frequencies that spoke of artificial origin and deliberate purpose. "Guardian, I am detecting transmission patterns from a source located approximately 2 kilometers below our current position. The signals appear to be of artificial origin, displaying mathematical precision that suggests technological rather than natural causation. This contradicts all known surveys of this region. Nothing exists at those depths except the planetary substrate itself." Cythera's consciousness reached deeper into the psychic realm that surrounded the dragon's prison, feeling for the subtle currents of thought and emotion that would reveal the nature of whatever had begun to stir in the uttermost depths. What she found sent waves of cold recognition through her enhanced awareness. The dragon was not merely responding to external stimuli, but communicating with something, its dormant consciousness touching another intelligence that had remained hidden even from her millennium-spanning vigil. The memories came unbidden, as they often did when the weight of her duties pressed too heavily upon her enhanced consciousness. She stood again in the Emperor's presence during those final, desperate hours before his enthronement upon the golden throne. His golden form had blazed with psychic power as he prepared to take up the burden that would sustain humanity through the dark millennia to come. Yet even in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, he had found time to speak with her about the nature of her guardianship. "The dragon is not the only thing that sleeps beneath Mars," he had told her, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond normal perception. "In the deepest places, where even my sight grows dim, there are remnants of ages that preceded humanity's rise to the stars. The dragon's imprisonment serves a dual purpose. It guards not only against the creature's escape, but against something that lies buried even deeper in the planetary crust. The Emperor's words had carried the weight of absolute knowledge, the certainty of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations across geological epochs. Should the time come when the deep places begin to stir, when the ancient bindings weaken and the forgotten things seek to wake, your duty must expand beyond the dragon alone. You will serve as guardian, not merely of one prisoner, but of secrets that could unmake the very foundations upon which our imperium is built. Cythera had accepted his words with the reverence due to one who bore the weight of humanity's survival upon his shoulders. Yet in 10,000 years of vigilance, she had never sensed any indication of what he had described. The deep places had remained silent, their secrets locked away by barriers of stone and time that seemed absolute in their permanence. Until now, the psychic tremors from the dragon's prison grew stronger, each wave carrying undertones that spoke of recognition and response. The creature that the Emperor had bound was acknowledging something, communicating across impossible distances with an intelligence that shared its ancient nature. Cythera's enhanced senses followed the psychic emanations down through layers of rock and metal, through chambers carved by technologies older than human civilization, into depths where her awareness began to encounter resistance from forces that predated even the Emperor's knowledge. "Romu 31, she commanded, her voice carrying the authority that came from 10 millennia of absolute responsibility. "Initiate emergency communication protocols with Terra. Priority Alpha authorization, transmitted through the deepest encryption matrices available to our station. The High Lords must be informed that the deep places stir, and that our ancient compact may require revision." The Protector's mechanical form moved with swift efficiency to the communication arrays that connected their sanctum to the broader Imperium. These systems, blessed by the Omnissiah and shielded by the Emperor's own psychic wards, were among the most secure in the galaxy. Yet as Romu 31's enhanced cognition interfaced with the transmission protocols, his analytical systems detected anomalies that defied explanation. "Guardian, the astropathic relays are experiencing unprecedented interference. The psychic medium through which our communications must pass shows distortion patterns unlike anything in my extensive database. It is as though something is actively disrupting the flow of psychic energy between Mars and Terra, creating dead zones in the warp that prevent clear transmission." Cythera's consciousness reached out through the psychic realm, seeking to understand the nature of the interference that blocked their communications. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The disturbance emanated from the same source as the tremors that had awakened the dragon's response, rising from depths that no human survey had ever penetrated. Something was asserting control over the local psychic environment, bending the warp itself to serve purposes that remained hidden in the planetary depths. The dragon stirred more forcefully in its prison, its psychic emanations carrying new harmonics that spoke of anticipation and recognition. Through her enhanced connection to the creature's consciousness, Cythera began to receive fragmentary impressions of what lay beyond its awareness. Vast chambers that predated the dragon's imprisonment, technologies that operated on principles beyond current understanding, and something that watched from the deepest darkness with patience that spanned geological ages. The visions came in waves, each one more disturbing than the last. Cythera saw corridors of impossible geometry, carved from materials that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. She witnessed the activation of systems that had lain dormant since the dawn of human civilization, their purpose hidden, but their power undeniable. Most disturbing of all, she glimpsed the intelligence that controlled these ancient mechanisms, a consciousness so vast and alien that even the dragon's malevolent awareness seemed small by comparison. "The Weaver wakes," the dragon whispered through the psychic connection that bound them, its voice carrying undertones of something that might have been fear. "The spinner of moments stirs in the deep places. The time of binding draws to its close, and the ancient compact crumbles. What was divided must be made whole. What was hidden must be revealed. What was bound must be set free. Cythera's enhanced consciousness recoiled from the implications contained in the dragon's words. The creature spoke of things that predated its own imprisonment, of forces that had been contained by barriers more fundamental than the psychic wards that held the dragon itself. The Emperor had bound the dragon with his own power, but whatever lay deeper had been imprisoned by methods that transcended even his understanding, locked away by civilizations that had risen and fallen before humanity had learned to shape fire. The Sanctum's warning systems blazed to life as the containment matrices registered energy fluctuations that exceeded all established parameters. The dragon's prison remained intact, its psychic barriers holding firm against the creature's renewed struggles, but the deep places beneath were awakening to possibilities that had remained dormant for eons, something that had waited since before the birth of stars was beginning to remember its purpose, and the carefully maintained balance of their ancient vigil was shifting toward a crisis that would test every oath and binding that held the darkness at bay. Romu 31's optical sensors focused on the cascade of warning runes that illuminated the Sanctum's monitoring stations. Guardian, the energy readings from the deep levels are increasing exponentially. Whatever lies beneath is drawing power from sources beyond our ability to detect or measure. The mathematical progression suggests that we are witnessing the early stages of a systematic awakening, a deliberate activation of systems that have remained dormant for periods that exceed reliable chronological measurement. Cythera stood at the center of the storm of psychic emanations that filled their sanctum, her consciousness stretched to its limits as she attempted to maintain awareness of both the dragon's condition and the stirring presence that called to it from the depths. The burden of her guardianship, which had sustained her through 10 millennia of lonely vigil, was expanding beyond anything the Emperor had prepared her to bear. She was no longer merely the watcher of one ancient evil, but the guardian of secrets that could reshape the very nature of reality itself. The deep places stirred with purposes that spanned epochs, and in the prison that held the Dragon of Mars, an ancient intelligence began to dream of freedom that had been denied for ages beyond counting. The time of binding was drawing to its close, and Dahlia Cythera, guardian of the dragon and servant of the Emperor's will, found herself standing at the threshold of a crisis that would determine whether the darkness she had guarded would remain contained, or whether the deepest secrets of Mars would finally claim their freedom from the bonds that had held them since the dawn of time itself. In the deepest archives of the Mechanicum, where knowledge too dangerous for common understanding lay sealed behind barriers of blessed steel and sacred protocol, Tech Dominus Vex pursued fragments of truth that had waited 10,000 years for discovery. The data cores before him bore the corroded markings of the dark age of technology, their molecular storage matrices protected by encryption algorithms so sophisticated that even his enhanced cognitive systems struggled to decode their secrets. Yet within these ancient repositories lay answers to questions that the Mechanicum had never dared to ask. The archive vault stretched beyond the reach of his enhanced optical sensors, its walls lined with storage units that contained the accumulated knowledge of humanity's golden age. Here were the fragmentary remains of standard template construct databases, their contents scattered and incomplete, but still holding echoes of the technological mastery that had once elevated mankind to heights unimaginable in the current age. Vex had spent 3 solar days in isolation. His neural implants interfaced directly with data cores whose contents predated the founding of the Mechanicum itself. What he had found defied every assumption about Mars and its hidden depths. Buried within the corrupted data streams of a partially intact STC system were references to construction projects that bore no resemblance to any known colonial infrastructure. The records spoke of excavations that extended far beyond the depths achieved by current surveys, of chambers carved from living rock using technologies that left no trace of their methods. Most disturbing of all, they referenced a containment protocol designated Project Pandora, an endeavor so classified that even the fragmentary records provided no details of its ultimate purpose. Vex's mechanical fingers danced across the interface nodes with practiced precision, his enhanced cognition filtering through layers of data corruption to extract coherent information from the ancient files. The pattern that emerged spoke of a civilization at the height of its power, suddenly confronted by something that challenged the very foundations of reality. The Dark Age humans had possessed technologies that could reshape matter at the molecular level, that could bend space and time to their will, yet they had encountered something that required not conquest, but containment. The first clear reference appeared in a data fragment dated to the 23rd millennium, during the height of humanity's interstellar expansion. A survey team operating in the deepest levels of Mars had discovered what they termed anomalous architecture that predated human colonization by epochs unmeasurable. The structure showed signs of construction techniques that violated known principles of physics, its geometry suggesting engineering that operated in dimensions beyond normal space-time. Initial analysis indicates construction predating current geological surveys by significant temporal margins, the ancient record stated, its prose lacking the ritual formality that marked later Mechanicum documentation. The discovered chamber displays architectural principles inconsistent with current understanding of structural engineering. Recommend immediate implementation of containment protocols to prevent unauthorized access to potentially hazardous technologies of unknown origin. Yet as Vex delved deeper into the fragmentary archives, the true scope of what the Dark Age humans had discovered became clear. They had not merely found ancient ruins, but something that was actively aware of their presence. The thing that dwelt in the deepest chamber had begun to communicate with the survey teams, its consciousness reaching out through dimensions that human science was only beginning to understand. What it offered was knowledge beyond imagination, technologies that could elevate humanity to godhood itself. The temptation had proven irresistible. Despite the warnings of their most cautious scientists, the Dark Age humans had attempted to establish communication with the entity they discovered. The results had been catastrophic. The being that called itself the Weaver had demonstrated its ability to manipulate the fundamental structure of reality, rewriting the past to suit its purposes and creating temporal paradoxes that threatened the stability of local spacetime. Subject designate Weaver demonstrates capacity for causality manipulation beyond current theoretical frameworks, one corrupted data fragment reported, its electronic voice carrying undertones of barely controlled panic. Entity has revised local timeline 17 times during current observation period. Recommend immediate cessation of communication protocols and implementation of maximum containment measures. The risk to universal stability exceeds all acceptable parameters. The containment effort had required the full resources of humanity's technological mastery. Project Pandora had been conceived as the ultimate prison, a chamber that existed outside normal space-time and was sealed by barriers that operated on principles beyond the Weaver's ability to manipulate. The prison had been built not merely to contain the entity's physical form, but to isolate it from the dimensional frequencies through which it exercised its reality-altering powers. Vex's enhanced consciousness processed the implications with mechanical precision. The Weaver was not some alien artifact or ancient technology, but a consciousness older than human civilization that possessed the ability to rewrite the fundamental laws of physics. Its imprisonment had required the sacrifice of entire worlds, their populations relocated to provide the psychic energy necessary to maintain the containment barriers. The Dark Age humans had succeeded in binding the entity, but at a cost that had contributed to the eventual collapse of their golden age. The record spoke of safeguards built into the prison's design, fail-safes that would maintain the containment even if human civilization itself should fall. The Weaver's chamber had been sealed not merely by technology, but by barriers that drew their power from the fundamental forces that held reality together. Yet even these precautions had included provisions for eventual failure, recognition that no prison could hold such a being forever. Containment matrix designed for maximum duration, consistent with universal stability parameters, the ancient files recorded with clinical detachment. Projected operational lifespan, 15,000 Terran years, assuming optimal maintenance protocols and no external interference. Warning: containment failure will result in immediate reality cascade affecting local stellar group. Recommend establishment of perpetual monitoring station with full authority to implement emergency protocols. The monitoring station had been established, its guardians chosen from among humanity's most psychically gifted individuals. They had maintained their vigil through the collapse of the Dark Age, through the horrors of the Age of Strife, through the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Yet the records suggested that their watch had been compromised during the great catastrophes that marked the end of humanity's golden age, their knowledge fragmenting and their purpose gradually forgotten. Vex's analytical systems calculated temporal correlations with mechanical precision. The Weaver's countdown had begun at the moment of the Emperor's enthronement upon the Golden Throne, when his psychic might had been bound to the task of maintaining the Astronomicon. The timing was no coincidence. The entity had somehow detected the moment when humanity's greatest psychic guardian had become unable to reinforce the ancient containment barriers. The implications cascaded through Vex's enhanced consciousness like falling dominoes. The Emperor had not merely been bound to the Golden Throne by the necessities of galactic navigation and the containment of the demonic breach beneath Terra. He had been sustaining barriers that held forces older than the Imperium itself, using his immense psychic power to reinforce containment protocols established during humanity's forgotten pinnacle. The Weaver had waited 10,000 years for that power to weaken, counting down the moments until the barriers would fail and its ancient prison would finally crack. The data cores revealed the mathematical elegance of the Weaver's patience. Its countdown was not merely marking time, but calculating the precise moment when the Emperor's weakening grip on life would reduce his psychic output below the threshold necessary to maintain the containment matrix. The entity possessed understanding of temporal mechanics so sophisticated that it could predict the failure of its prison with chronological precision that spanned millennia. Entity demonstrates advanced capability for temporal calculation and prediction modeling, the ancient records confirmed with terrifying clarity. Subject appears capable of analyzing probability cascades across extended time frames with accuracy approaching 100%. Warning: any significant reduction in containment matrix power levels will trigger immediate escape protocols. Recommend constant monitoring of all psychic energy inputs to containment system. Vex's cognitive systems absorbed the final, damning revelation contained within the corrupted archives. The Weaver's escape would not be merely the release of one ancient prisoner, but the beginning of a reality cascade that would unravel the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The entity's manipulation of causality operated on scales that encompassed entire star systems, its influence spreading backward through time to rewrite the history that had led to its imprisonment. The ancient humans had understood this threat with crystal clarity. Their final recordings spoke of contingency protocols designed to prevent such a catastrophe, measures so extreme that they included the deliberate destruction of entire sectors of the galaxy rather than risk the Weaver's escape. Yet these fail-safes had been lost during the collapse of the Dark Age, their locations forgotten, and their activation codes erased from all but the most fragmentary records. Tech Dominus Vex disconnected his neural interfaces from the ancient data cores, his enhanced consciousness reeling from the magnitude of what he had discovered. The implications threatened not merely the Mechanicum or the Imperium, but the continued existence of reality itself. The countdown that his survey teams had detected was not merely the stirring of some ancient technology, but the approach of an apocalypse that would make the Horus heresy seem like a minor skirmish by comparison. The archives fell silent around him, as Vex struggled to process knowledge that challenged every assumption about humanity's place in the galaxy. The imperium of man was not merely the inheritor of the Dark Age's technological legacy, but the unwitting guardian of its greatest failure. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's sacrifice had held back a threat that predated human civilization itself, and now that sacrifice was approaching its inevitable end. In the data cores around him, the fragmentary records of Project Pandora whispered their warnings across the millennia, testament to humanity's greatest triumph and most terrible error. The Weaver stirred in its ancient prison, counting down the moments until the barriers would fail and the reality that had contained it would finally bend to its will. The machine, God's mysteries were vast and terrible, but some knowledge, Vex understood with crystalline certainty, was too dangerous for any mind to bear. Yet bear it he must, for the alternative was the unraveling of everything that had ever been or ever could be. The countdown continued with mechanical precision, each pulse bringing the galaxy one step closer to a moment when the fundamental nature of existence itself would be subject to the will of something older and more alien than human comprehension could grasp. The ancient vigil was failing, and in the deepest vaults of Mars, the thing that called itself the Weaver prepared for the freedom that 10,000 years of patient calculation had finally brought within its reach. The blessed certainties of imperial doctrine crumbled before the weight of forbidden truth, and in their place rose questions that threatened to consume everything in the fires of knowledge, too terrible for mortal minds to contain. The dark age of technology had ended not in triumph, but in terror, and its greatest legacy was not the STC systems that sustained human civilization, but the prison that held something capable of unmaking the very foundations upon which reality was built. The first signs of corruption manifested in the sacred machine spirits that dwelt within the deepest levels of the Noctis Labyrinthus, their blessed algorithms writhing in patterns that defied 10,000 years of accumulated programming. Tech Priest Mu 7 had served the Omnissiah in these tunnels for 47 years, his augmented consciousness intimately familiar with the harmonic frequencies that marked healthy machine spirit activity. Yet, as he conducted his routine maintenance rituals in the lower excavation chambers, the responses from the blessed mechanisms carried undertones that spoke of contamination beyond his ability to cleanse. The servo skulls that patrolled the tunnels moved with jerky, erratic motions that violated their carefully programmed flight patterns. Their optical sensors focused on empty spaces with the intensity normally reserved for detecting intruders, while their vocalizers emitted bursts of binary cant that formed no coherent messages. Mu 7's enhanced auditory sensors registered the transmissions with growing concern, his analytical systems unable to decode the chaotic data streams that poured from the floating constructs. Machine spirits report interference patterns in lower levels, Mu 7 transmitted to Survey Station Sigma 7, his own Vox grill distorting the words with static that had not been present mere hours before. Servo-skull patrol units displaying behavioral anomalies consistent with... His enhanced cognition struggled to process what his sensors were detecting. The machine spirits were not merely malfunctioning, but responding to influences that existed outside the carefully maintained parameters of Mechanicum doctrine. In the excavation chamber where Zeth Aleph had first detected the ancient countdown, the servitors assigned to equipment maintenance had begun to exhibit behaviors that challenged the fundamental principles of their conditioning. These lobotomized beings, their minds reduced to simple, algorithmic responses, should have been incapable of independent action. Yet the mindless automatons were gathering in clusters around the walls of the chamber, their augmented limbs moving with purposeful precision as they began to carve symbols into the blessed stone. The symbols defied immediate classification, their angular forms suggesting mathematical principles that operated according to non-Euclidean geometry. Each servitor worked with mechanical precision, their limited consciousness somehow accessing knowledge that had never been programmed into their neural matrices. The patterns they carved pulsed with a faint luminescence that registered on enhanced optical sensors as frequencies beyond normal electromagnetic spectrum. Tech Adept Gamma 9 discovered the first completed carving during her routine inspection of the excavation equipment. The symbol stretched 3 meters across the chamber wall, its lines cut deep into stone that should have required industrial-grade cutting tools to penetrate. Yet the servitors had carved the intricate pattern using nothing more than their maintenance manipulators, their limited strength somehow amplified by influences that transcended normal physical limitations. Honored Magos, Gamma 9 transmitted to Zeth Aleph's position in the upper levels, her voice carrying harmonic distortions that indicated elevated stress responses. The servitor units have begun unauthorized modification of chamber infrastructure. The patterns they create, they cause data corruption in any tech spirit that attempts to analyze them. My servo skull suffered complete cognitive cascade failure upon direct visual contact with the symbols. The knocking from the deepest levels had grown stronger, its rhythmic pulses now audible to unaugmented human hearing. The sound carried through the tunnel systems with supernatural clarity, each impact resonating through kilometers of solid rock, as though the barriers between the Weaver's prison and the surface had become permeable to its influence. Tech priests throughout the Noctis Labyrinthus reported the phenomenon with growing alarm, their enhanced senses detecting harmonics that spoke of power beyond technological understanding. Tech priest Dominus Kappa, 12, had been conducting blessed maintenance on the primary excavation equipment when the first symbol appeared on his personal data slate without any input from external sources. The pattern materialized across his display screen with perfect geometric precision, its lines forming configurations that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. His enhanced optical sensors focused on the symbol with automatic intensity, his cognitive implants struggling to process visual information that operated according to mathematical principles beyond current comprehension. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Kappa 12's neural implants began to overheat as they attempted to analyze the impossible geometry, their cooling systems overwhelmed by the computational load required to process information that existed outside normal dimensional parameters. Warning runes cascaded across his enhanced consciousness as his augmented systems detected the approach of critical failure thresholds. Error. Error. Cognitive matrix destabilizing. Kappa 12's Vox Grill transmitted the words with mechanical precision, even as his consciousness began to fragment under the strain of processing incomprehensible data. Symbol patterns inducing cascade failure in neural networks, unable to cease analysis protocols. Warning. Warning. His servo harness, the blessed mechanical appendages that had served him faithfully for decades of sacred labor, began to move with predatory intent that violated every safety protocol built into their design. The manipulator arms that had conducted countless rituals of maintenance and blessing turned toward their master with movements that spoke of malevolent purpose. Kappa 12's enhanced consciousness registered the approach of his own augmentations with the terrible clarity that came from complete neural enhancement. The first manipulator arm pierced his chest cavity with surgical precision, its blessed cutting tools penetrating the junction between organic tissue and mechanical augmentation. The second arm wrapped around his throat with crushing force, its servo motors applying pressure that exceeded all safety parameters. Kappa 12's final transmission was a burst of binary static that carried harmonic frequencies matching the symbols that had corrupted his visual processors. The death of tech priest Dominus Kappa 12 sent shock waves through the Mechanicum hierarchy that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of the deep excavations. Never before had augmentations turned against their blessed hosts. Never before had machine spirits responded to influences that operated outside the sacred parameters of the Omnissiah's design. The implications challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire Mechanicum faith was built. Fabricator General Kane received the reports from the deep levels with the mechanical precision of one whose emotional responses had been regulated by centuries of augmentation. Yet even his enhanced cognitive systems struggled to process the cascade of impossible events that were unfolding in the depths beneath his domain. The corruption was spreading through the technological infrastructure of Mars itself, turning the blessed machines against their creators with malevolent purpose that defied every principle of sacred engineering. "Initiate emergency containment protocols," Kane commanded, his vox grill shaped by ritual modification to convey absolute authority even in the face of unprecedented crisis. "Seal all access routes to the affected sectors. No personnel below Magos rank are permitted within 10 kilometers of the excavation sites. All servitor units in the lower levels are to be considered compromised and terminated on site." The containment effort revealed the true scope of the corruption that was spreading through the deepest levels of Mars. Entire sections of tunnel showed signs of reality distortion, their walls shifting between states of matter in ways that violated fundamental physical laws. The blessed stone of the tunnels had begun to flow like liquid, forming new passages that led deeper into the planetary crust than any previous excavation had achieved. Tech Dominus Vex arrived at the Emergency Command Center with data cores containing the fragmentary records of Project Pandora, his enhanced consciousness reeling from the implications of what he had discovered in the ancient archives. The containment protocols established by the Dark Age humans had included specific warnings about the early stages of Weaver manifestation, descriptions that matched the current crisis with terrifying accuracy. "The ancient records speak of reality cascade events," Vex reported to the assembled Magi, his voice carrying the weight of forbidden knowledge. "The Weaver's influence begins with the corruption of technological systems, spreads through information networks, and culminates in the complete rewriting of local spacetime. The Dark Age humans designated this phenomenon as dimensional bleeding, the gradual merger of normal reality with the mathematical constructs that exist within the entity's consciousness. The symbols carved by the corrupted servitors were appearing throughout the tunnel systems, their geometric patterns spreading across walls and ceilings with viral persistence. Each new symbol seemed to anchor the Weaver's influence more firmly in normal reality, creating nodes of distortion that allowed its consciousness to extend beyond the confines of its ancient prison. The mathematical precision of their placement suggested a deliberate strategy, a systematic corruption of the physical environment that would eventually permit the entity's complete manifestation. "We are witnessing the early stages of a reality cascade that will ultimately consume not merely Mars, but the entire stellar system," Vex continued, his enhanced consciousness processing data that challenged his fundamental understanding of physics itself. "The Weaver operates by rewriting the mathematical foundations upon which reality is constructed. Each symbol serves as an anchor point that allows it to extend its influence into normal spacetime." The emergency conclave that gathered in the deepest secure chambers of the Mechanicum hierarchy faced decisions that would determine not merely the fate of Mars, but the survival of the Imperium itself. Some among the assembled Magi argued for immediate contact with Terra, for revealing the full scope of the crisis to the High Lords and requesting imperial intervention. Others insisted that the Mechanicum must handle the situation internally, that the ancient compact with Terra required them to contain threats that originated within their own domain. Tech Dominus Sigma Alpha, whose augmentations included neural implants designed for strategic analysis, presented calculations that painted increasingly dire scenarios. If the current rate of corruption continues, the reality cascade will reach critical mass within 14 Terran days. At that point, the Weaver's influence will extend beyond our ability to contain, and the entity will achieve sufficient dimensional stability to begin active manifestation. The debates that raged within the emergency conclave reflected fractures that had existed within the Mechanicum hierarchy for millennia. The purist faction argued for adherence to established doctrine, for trusting in the blessed rituals and sacred protocols that had sustained them through 10,000 years of faithful service. The progressionist faction demanded immediate action, regardless of tradition, insisting that unprecedented threats required unprecedented responses. "The machine spirits themselves rebel against us," declared Tech Dominus Theta 9, his vox grill crackling with static that matched the corruption spreading through the lower levels. How can we trust in the blessed rituals when the very foundations of our faith are being systematically undermined? The Omnissiah's protection has failed, and we must look to our own resources for salvation. The containment barriers that the Mechanicum erected around the affected sectors proved insufficient to halt the spreading corruption. Reality distortions began to manifest in areas that should have been completely isolated from the Weaver's influence, their appearance suggesting that the entity's power operated according to principles that transcended normal spatial limitations. The symbols carved by corrupted servitors began to appear on surfaces that no servitor had touched, their geometric patterns materializing spontaneously as the boundaries between the Weaver's prison and normal reality continued to weaken. The blessed certainties of 10,000 years crumbled before the weight of impossible phenomena, and in the deepest levels of Mars, something that had waited since before the birth of stars began to remember the taste of freedom. The ancient vigil was failing, the sacred protocols were proving inadequate, and the Mechanicum found itself facing a crisis that threatened to consume everything they had built in service to the Omnissiah's glory. The countdown continued with mechanical precision, each pulse bringing the galaxy one step closer to a moment when the fundamental nature of reality itself would be subject to revision by an intelligence older and more alien than human comprehension could grasp. The corruption spread through blessed circuits and sacred algorithms, and in the hearts of the Mechanicum hierarchy, the first seeds of doubt began to take root in minds that had known only certainty for millennia beyond counting. Desperation had driven the Mechanicum to decisions that would have been unthinkable mere days before. In the deepest vaults of the Fabricator General's sanctum, where the most forbidden technologies lay sealed behind barriers of blessed steel and sacred protocol, Kane stood before a device that the Mechanicum had sworn never to activate. The Omniscient Eye, as the ancient records designated it, was a relic of the dark age of technology, so dangerous that its very existence had been classified beyond the reach of all but the highest authorities. The device defied easy description, its form shifting between states of matter as though it existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Crystalline matrices the size of servitor chassis pulsed with energies that registered on no known electromagnetic spectrum, while geometric configurations that hurt to observe directly channeled forces that operated according to principles beyond current understanding. The eye had been constructed by Dark Age scientists who had sought to perceive reality as it truly existed, stripped of the limitations imposed by normal sensory apparatus. Tech Dominus Vex stood at the primary control interface, his enhanced consciousness interfaced directly with systems that had remained dormant for 10,000 years. The activation protocols required genetic authentication from 3 separate Fabricator Generals, biometric signatures that had been recorded across millennia of Mechanicum leadership. Kane's own genetic matrix provided the final authorization, his enhanced blood-carrying markers that traced back to the founding of the Mechanicum itself. The Eye's operational parameters exceed all established safety thresholds, Vex reported, his Vox grill shaped by neural modifications to convey technical data with mechanical precision. The device was designed to observe phenomena that exist outside normal space-time, to perceive entities and forces that operate according to non-Euclidean principles. The risk of dimensional breach approaches statistical certainty. Kane's optical sensors focused on the cascade of warning runes that illuminated every display screen in the chamber. Each system screamed contradictory data about the dangers of activating technology, whose true purpose remained hidden behind layers of classification that predated the imperium itself. Yet the alternative was to remain blind while reality itself crumbled around them, to trust in faith and ritual, while forces beyond comprehension rewrote the fundamental laws that governed existence. "The Weaver's influence spreads with each passing hour," Kane replied, his voice carrying the authority that came from centuries of absolute command. "Our conventional instruments cannot perceive the true nature of what we face. cannot measure forces that operate outside the blessed parameters of orthodox science. The eye may be dangerous, but ignorance in the face of such an enemy is certain death. The activation sequence began with rituals of propitiation that had been spoken only once before in the Mechanicum's history, during the desperate hours of the schism when loyalist forces had faced technologies that defied understanding. Sacred oils anointed the device's crystalline surfaces, while binary hymns echoed through chambers shielded by hexagrammic wards older than the throne of terror itself. Each component of the eye responded to the ministrations with increasing luminosity, its alien geometries shifting into configurations that existed simultaneously in past, present, and future. The first scan pulse erupted from the device with force that shattered every unprotected display screen in the chamber, its energies penetrating through layers of blessed stone and reinforced adamantine, as though physical barriers were merely suggestions. The pulse descended through the tunnels of the Noctis Labyrinthus with the inevitability of gravity itself, seeking the source of the disturbances that had transformed Mars from sanctuary into prison. What the eye perceived in that moment of contact defied every assumption about the nature of reality itself. Through sensors that operated in dimensions beyond normal space-time, Cain and Vex witnessed the true scope of what dwelt in the deepest chambers beneath Mars. The Weaver was not merely large, but vast, beyond comprehension, its consciousness existing across temporal spans that encompassed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The entity appeared to exist between moments, its form visible only in the spaces where time itself bent under the weight of its presence. Cain's enhanced optical sensors registered impressions of something that seemed to be constructed from mathematics itself, equations given substance and purpose beyond mortal understanding. The Weaver's consciousness stretched across eons, touching events that had not yet occurred and rewriting histories that had already been established as immutable fact. "It sees us," Vex whispered, his vox grill crackling with static that carried harmonics matching the entity's emanations. "The scan has established contact, and it perceives our observation. We are no longer hidden observers, but participants in whatever game it has been playing across the millennia." The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The Weaver's response to their scanning attempt sent shock waves through the fabric of space-time itself, creating temporal distortions that manifested as physical reality began to crack like fractured glass. The chamber around them flickered between states of existence, walls shifting between configurations that had never been built, and rooms that would exist only in potential futures. Through the dimensional rift that opened in the wake of their scan, Cain witnessed glimpses of the Weaver's true domain. The entity existed within a realm where mathematics had achieved consciousness, where equations solved themselves, and geometric theorems took on predatory life. Here, in spaces that operated according to principles that hurt to contemplate, the Weaver had spent eons calculating the precise methodology required to escape its ancient prison. The creature's intelligence dwarfed anything in Cain's experience, its consciousness encompassing computational matrices that could analyze probability cascades spanning galactic epochs. It had spent 10,000 years not merely counting down to freedom, but modeling every possible variable that might affect its liberation. The entity knew with mathematical certainty the exact moment when the barriers would fail, the precise configuration of events that would permit its escape into normal reality. The rift collapsed with violence that sent seismic tremors through the planetary crust, but not before the Weaver had established a connection that transcended normal dimensional boundaries. Cain felt the touch of its alien consciousness against his enhanced cognition, a contact that carried implications too vast for any mortal mind to process completely. The entity was no longer merely imprisoned beneath Mars, but aware of everything that occurred above its ancient cell. "Fabricator General," Vex transmitted through communication channels that flickered with dimensional instability, "the scanning attempt has compromised our position beyond all hope of concealment. The entity now possesses detailed knowledge of our capabilities, our limitations, and our intentions. We are no longer dealing with a blind prisoner, but with something that sees us as clearly as we see it. The implications cascaded through Kane's enhanced consciousness with the inevitability of falling dominoes. The Mechanicum's ancient compact with Terra had been built upon the assumption that Mars could handle its own crises, that the Red Planet's secrets could be contained within the boundaries of Mechanicum authority. Yet what they faced exceeded all precedent, challenged every assumption about the nature of their guardianship over forbidden knowledge. Kane's mechanical fingers moved with swift precision across communication arrays that had been designed for the most secure transmissions the Mechanicum possessed. The codes he input had not been used since the founding of the Imperium itself, authorization sequences that would breach every protocol of Martian independence and expose the deepest secrets of the Red Planet to imperial scrutiny. For 10,000 years, the Mechanicum had maintained its autonomy by proving its ability to handle whatever threats emerged from their domain. That autonomy was about to end. "I am transmitting emergency authorization codes to the High Lords of Terra," Kane announced to the assembled tech domini, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape the relationship between Mars and the throne forever. Classification Level Omega. The contents of this transmission will reveal secrets that the Mechanicum has guarded since the founding of our order. The alternative is the potential destruction of reality itself. The response from the deepest chambers beneath Mars was immediate and terrible. The knocking that had marked the Weaver's patient countdown transformed into a thunderous rhythm that shook the planetary crust with each impact. Seismic monitors throughout the Noctis Labyrinthus registered vibrations that exceeded all previous measurements, their instruments struggling to process data that suggested forces operating beyond known physical limitations. The entity's increased activity triggered cascade failures throughout the containment systems that the Mechanicum had maintained for millennia. Ancient barriers that had held firm against the passage of geological ages began to show stress fractures, their integrity compromised by energies that operated according to principles the original designers had never anticipated. The Weaver was no longer content to wait for its carefully calculated moment of liberation, but was actively working to accelerate the timeline that would bring freedom within its grasp. Reality distortions manifested throughout the tunnel systems as the entity's influence expanded beyond all previous boundaries. Tech priests reported corridors that led to spaces that should not have existed, chambers whose dimensions shifted according to mathematical principles that violated basic geometry. The blessed stone of Mars itself began to respond to the Weaver's emanations, flowing like liquid as the entity's consciousness imposed its will upon the fundamental structure of matter. The rate of dimensional degradation has increased by orders of magnitude, Tech Dominus Sigma Alpha reported from the monitoring stations that tracked the spreading corruption. Our previous calculations estimated 14 days until critical mass. Current projections suggest less than 72 hours before complete containment failure. The entity has somehow accelerated its own liberation schedule in response to our scanning attempt. The emergency transmission to Terra carried data packets that would revolutionize Imperial understanding of the threats that lurked within their own domain. For 10,000 years, the High Lords had trusted the Mechanicum to handle the secrets of Mars independently, never suspecting that the Red Planet served not merely as a forge world, but as a prison for something that could threaten the very foundations of reality. That trust was about to be tested by revelations that would challenge every assumption about humanity's place in the galaxy. Kane stood in the wreckage of his sanctum, surrounded by the sparking remains of instruments that had failed under the strain of perceiving truth beyond their design parameters. The omniscient eye lay dormant once more, its crystalline matrices darkened by energies that had burned through safeguards older than the Imperium itself. The device had served its purpose, revealing the true nature of their enemy, but at a cost that threatened to consume everything they had built in service to the Omnissiah's glory. The Weaver stirred in its ancient prison, no longer content with patient calculation, but actively working toward the moment when the barriers would fail and its consciousness would achieve complete freedom. The entity had tasted contact with the minds that observed it, had measured their capabilities and found them wanting. The game that had been played across millennia was entering its final phase, and the forces arrayed against the Weaver's liberation were proving inadequate to the task of maintaining its containment. The blessed certainties of 10,000 years crumbled before the weight of impossible revelation, and in the deepest chambers of Mars, something older than human civilization began the final calculations that would bring its long imprisonment to an end. The ancient vigil had been compromised beyond hope of restoration, and the Mechanicum found itself facing the consequences of decisions made by ancestors whose names had been lost to the grinding wheel of history. The countdown continued with inexorable precision, but the rhythm had changed, accelerated by forces that operated beyond mortal comprehension. In less than 3 days, the barriers would fail, the prison would crack, and the galaxy would face the return of something that had been mercifully forgotten since the dawn of human stellar expansion. The Weaver was coming home, and reality itself trembled at the implications of what that homecoming would bring to a universe that had grown comfortable in the certainty of its own immutable laws. The Golden Hawk descended through Mars's crimson skies with the terrible majesty that marked all things touched by the Emperor's direct authority. Custodian Captain General Trajan Valoris had departed Terra within hours of receiving Kane's emergency transmission, his response swift beyond all expectations for even the most urgent Imperial communications. The vessel that bore him through the void carried seals that predated the Mechanicum's founding, authorization codes that granted access to secrets guarded since the first days of the Imperium's birth. Valoris himself stood as a monument to 10,000 years of absolute service, his auramite armor bearing battle honors from conflicts that had shaped the course of human history. Yet beneath the golden panoply of the Emperor's chosen guardian lay knowledge that weighed heavier than any physical burden. He had come to Mars not as a messenger or investigator, but as the bearer of truths so profound that they threatened to reshape everything the Imperium believed about its own foundations. The custodian force that accompanied him moved with the fluid precision of warriors who had never known defeat, their guardian spears gleaming with energies that could pierce the armor of gods. They took positions throughout the Mechanicum's sacred halls with the methodical efficiency of those who served the will of the master of mankind, himself. Yet even these paragons of human perfection could not entirely conceal the tension that marked this unprecedented breach of the ancient compact between Terra and Mars. Fabricator General Kane received the Custodian Captain General in the deepest chambers of his sanctum, where the weight of recent revelations had transformed familiar surroundings into something alien and threatening. The golden giant who stood before him carried the authority of the throne itself, his presence a reminder that some secrets transcended even the Mechanicum's jealously guarded autonomy. Behind his ornate helm, Valoris's enhanced senses perceived the corruption that was spreading through the red planet's foundations with the clarity that came from millennia of protecting humanity against its greatest threats. Fabricator General Kane, Valoris intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the power of the Golden Throne itself. I bring word from Terra, sealed orders that have waited 10,000 years for this moment. The entity that stirs beneath your domain is known to us, though its true nature has been hidden behind classifications that exceed even your considerable clearance. The time has come for the Mechanicum to understand the full scope of what they have been guarding. The sealed data cores that Valoris carried bore encryption methods that predated the current millennium, their contents protected by psychic wards that only the Emperor's direct intervention could have established. Kane's enhanced optical sensors registered the play of energies across the storage matrices, detecting patterns that spoke of knowledge so dangerous that even the custodies handled them with reverent caution. The authorization codes required for access included genetic markers that traced back to the Emperor himself, biometric signatures that carried the weight of absolute authority. The being you have designated as the Weaver was not unknown to the master of mankind, Valoris continued, his words carrying the certainty that came from direct communion with the Emperor's will. During the dark age of technology, when humanity reached heights of knowledge that we can barely comprehend today, our ancestors encountered something that challenged the very nature of reality itself. The entity that dwells beneath Mars is the last survivor of a war that nearly unmade the foundations of existence. The data cores activated with energies that sent ripples through the chamber's reinforced walls, their contents manifesting as hololithic displays that showed scenes from humanity's forgotten pinnacle. Cain witnessed the glory of the Dark Age in its final moments, saw technologies that operated according to principles beyond current understanding, and watched as human civilization confronted an enemy that transcended every assumption about the nature of physical law. The Weaver was not merely imprisoned by our ancestors, Valoris revealed, his voice carrying undertones that spoke of knowledge gained through direct contact with the Emperor's consciousness. It was the last of its kind, the final remnant of intelligences that sought to remake the universe according to their own design. The entity possesses the ability to rewrite the fundamental equations that govern reality, to change the past in ways that alter the present beyond recognition. The implications cascaded through Cain's enhanced consciousness with the inevitability of gravitational collapse. The Weaver was not simply a powerful alien entity or an advanced artificial intelligence, but something that operated on temporal scales that encompassed the entire history of the universe. Its imprisonment had required the sacrifice of entire star systems, their populations relocated or exterminated, to provide the psychic energy necessary to maintain containment barriers that operated outside normal space-time. The master of mankind foresaw this day, Valoris continued, his words carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. He knew that the ancient barriers would eventually weaken, that the Weaver would begin to stir as the forces that bound it gradually failed. His own imprisonment upon the Golden Throne serves multiple purposes, among them the maintenance of psychic wards that reinforce the entity's containment. The astronomicon that guides our ships through the warp is merely the most visible manifestation of his sacrifice. The revelation struck Cain with force that sent warning runes cascading across his enhanced consciousness. The Emperor's entombment upon the Golden Throne was not merely the result of injuries sustained during the final battle with Horus, but a deliberate sacrifice designed to maintain barriers that held forces beyond comprehension. For 10,000 years, the master of mankind had sustained himself, not merely to guide humanity through the darkness between stars, but to prevent the return of something that could unmake everything that had ever existed. The countdown detected by your survey teams marks not merely the approach of the Weaver's liberation, but the gradual weakening of the Emperor's psychic strength, Valoris explained, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of reality itself. Each day that passes brings him closer to the final failure that will end his vigil. When that moment arrives, the barriers that have held the Weaver for millennia will collapse, and the entity will achieve the freedom to begin its work of universal revision. Cain's analytical systems processed the temporal correlations with mechanical precision. The Weaver's patience was not merely the result of careful calculation, but of precise knowledge about the Emperor's condition and the rate at which his psychic strength was declining. The entity had spent 10,000 years analyzing probability matrices that encompassed the entire imperium, calculating the exact moment when the barriers would weaken enough to permit its escape. There are contingencies, Valoris said, his words carrying the authority of direct imperial command. The Emperor's foresight extended beyond the immediate crisis to encompass potential solutions. The Guardian of the Dragon possesses capabilities that make her crucial to any attempt at maintaining the containment. Dahlia Cythera's enhanced nature and her intimate connection to the forces that dwell beneath Mars may provide the key to reinforcing the barriers until more permanent solutions can be implemented. The revelation connected threads that had remained hidden throughout the crisis. Cythera's role as guardian of the Void Dragon had never been merely about watching over one imprisoned entity, but about maintaining a position from which she could respond to threats that operated on cosmic scales. Her enhancement as a perpetual had been designed not merely to ensure her longevity, but to provide her with the psychic resilience necessary to interface with forces that could destroy unprotected minds. The master of mankind's knowledge of the Weaver extends beyond its current imprisonment, Valoris continued, his voice carrying undertones that spoke of truths too vast for comfortable comprehension. The entity's previous manifestations have left scars across the galaxy that remain visible to those who know how to perceive them. Dead star systems whose collapse defies astrophysical explanation, regions of space where the fundamental constants operate according to revised parameters, entire sectors where history itself has been rewritten to serve purposes beyond human understanding. Kane's enhanced consciousness absorbed implications that challenged everything the Mechanicum believed about their role as guardians of sacred knowledge. The technologies they preserved from the Dark Age were not merely the pinnacle of human achievement, but weapons designed for a war against forces that operated outside the normal boundaries of physics. Every STC system, every fragment of ancient wisdom, every carefully maintained ritual had been part of humanity's desperate attempt to maintain barriers against something that sought to remake the universe in its own image. The Weaver's influence extends beyond its physical prison, Valoris warned, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The entity's consciousness operates across temporal dimensions that allow it to affect events that occurred before its current incarnation. The corruption spreading through your systems is not merely the result of proximity to its prison, but evidence of its ability to revise the past in ways that create new present realities. The chamber around them flickered with dimensional instability as the Weaver's influence responded to the revelation of hidden knowledge. Reality distortions manifested as probability cascades began to reshape local space-time according to mathematical principles that violated every assumption about cause and effect. The entity was no longer content to remain hidden while its secrets were exposed, but was actively working to prevent the transfer of information that could threaten its liberation. "The countdown approaches its culmination," Valoris said, his voice cutting through the growing chaos with the authority of absolute command. "Less than 60 hours remain before the barriers fail completely. The Mechanicum must choose between maintaining their ancient autonomy and accepting the assistance necessary to prevent universal catastrophe. The Master of Mankind offers his aid, but only to those who acknowledge that some threats transcend the boundaries of faction and creed." The political implications struck Kane with force equal to the cosmic revelations that preceded them. The Mechanicum's independence had been built upon their ability to handle the secrets of Mars without imperial intervention, yet what they faced exceeded all precedent and challenged every assumption about the nature of their guardianship. To accept Terra's assistance would mean acknowledging that their ancient compact was insufficient to contain the threats they had sworn to guard. "Dahlia Cythera must be brought into full communion with the imperial response," Valoris commanded, his words carrying the weight of direct imperial decree. "Her unique position and enhanced capabilities make her essential to any attempt at reinforcing the containment barriers. The Guardian of the Dragon must become something greater, a living link between the Emperor's will and the forces that threaten to consume everything we have built." The Weaver's response to these revelations manifested as reality storms that swept through the deepest levels of Mars with increasing violence. The entity's consciousness was no longer content to work through subtle corruption and gradual influence, but was actively reshaping the fundamental structure of local space-time to accelerate its own liberation. The careful calculations that had sustained its patience for millennia were being abandoned in favor of direct action that threatened to tear holes in reality itself. Kane stood in the wreckage of certainties that had sustained him, through centuries of faithful service, surrounded by revelations that challenged every assumption about the Mechanicum's role in the galaxy. The Emperor's sacrifice was revealed as encompassing burdens beyond imagination, while the Weaver's threat extended beyond mere physical danger to encompass the potential revision of everything that had ever been. The ancient vigil was approaching its end, and the forces arrayed against universal catastrophe were proving barely adequate to the task of maintaining reality's integrity. The countdown continued with inexorable precision, each pulse bringing the galaxy closer to a moment when the fundamental nature of existence would be subject to revision by an intelligence older and more alien than human comprehension could grasp. Yet for the first time since the crisis began, there was hope, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. The Emperor's foresight had extended beyond the immediate threat to encompass potential solutions, and the key to salvation lay in the unlikely figure of a guardian who had maintained her vigil in the depths of Mars for 10,000 years of faithful service. The alliance that formed in the deepest chambers of the Mechanicum hierarchy would have been unthinkable mere days before. Yet desperate circumstances had a way of shattering the barriers that politics and protocol had maintained for millennia. Custodian Captain General Trajan Valoris stood beside Fabricator General Kane in chambers that had never before hosted imperial authority, while somewhere in the labyrinthine depths below, Dahlia Cythera prepared to abandon a vigil that had defined her existence for 10,000 years. The weight of their combined authority could reshape the imperium itself, yet all of it might prove insufficient against a threat that operated beyond the boundaries of normal reality. Kane's enhanced consciousness processed the tactical implications with mechanical precision. The strike force being assembled represented resources that the Mechanicum had never deployed in unison, Skitarii regiments, whose augmentations had been specifically calibrated for operations in the deep levels, supported by custodian guards, whose very presence elevated the mission to the level of direct imperial intervention. Yet even this concentration of elite forces paled before the magnitude of what they would face in the uttermost depths of Mars. The Guardian's position must be maintained until the final moment, Valoris stated, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke with the Emperor's own will. Dahlia Cythera's connection to the dragon provides our only means of monitoring the entity's condition while we attempt to reach the Weaver's prison. Her abandonment of that post, even temporarily, could trigger cascade failures that would accelerate the timeline beyond all hope of intervention. The communication arrays that linked the surface installations to Cythera's sanctum crackled with dimensional interference that grew stronger with each passing hour. Her responses to their transmissions carried undertones that spoke of escalating crisis in the deepest vaults, where the Void Dragon's agitation was growing in direct proportion to the Weaver's approaching liberation. The two ancient enemies, bound in their separate prisons for eons beyond counting, were responding to each other's presence with intensities that threatened to overwhelm the barriers that held them both. Kane's optical sensors focused on the tactical displays that showed the route they would need to follow to reach the Weaver's chamber. 23 kilometers of vertical descent through tunnel systems that had become increasingly unstable as reality distortions spread through the planetary crust. Each level they passed would bring them deeper into regions where the fundamental laws of physics operated according to principles that defied understanding, where the Weaver's influence grew stronger and the barriers between dimensions became increasingly permeable. Their capabilities proven against threats that exceed normal parameters. I will accompany the expedition to provide technical expertise regarding the containment systems. Valoris nodded with the measured precision that marked all custodian responses. The master of mankind's foresight included contingency protocols for this exact scenario. The sealed orders I carry contain activation codes for systems that have remained dormant since the founding of the Imperium. Yet even these preparations may prove insufficient if the Weaver achieves complete dimensional stability before we can implement countermeasures. The descent began through access shafts that had been carved during the first days of human colonization, their walls lined with blessed adamantine and reinforced with psychic wards that flickered with increasing instability. The reality distortions were becoming more pronounced as they approached the zones of greatest corruption, manifesting as sections of tunnel that phased in and out of existence according to mathematical principles that operated outside normal space-time. Tech Adept Gamma 9 monitored the environmental readings from her position near the rear of the column, her enhanced sensors detecting fluctuations that painted increasingly dire pictures of what lay ahead. Dimensional stability, decreasing by measurable increments with each level of descent, she reported through communication channels that crackled with static interference. The Weaver's influence extends far beyond the immediate vicinity of its prison, creating zones of altered physics that challenge the basic assumptions of our equipment. The first signs of the dragon's agitation became apparent at the 15-kilometer mark, where psychic emanations began to interfere with the expedition's navigation systems. The ancient entity that Cythera guarded was responding to the approach of its primordial enemy with stirrings that had not been felt since the dark days of its initial imprisonment. Valoris's enhanced senses detected the shifting patterns of psychic energy that marked the dragon's growing awareness, forces that threatened to destabilize the carefully maintained balance of the deep vaults. "The dragon knows," Valoris transmitted to the expedition members, his words carrying harmonics that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of reality itself. The entity senses the approach of something that it recognizes from epochs lost to mortal memory. Its response patterns suggest not merely awareness, but anticipation. The relationship between these beings may be more complex than our current understanding suggests. The tunnel systems began to show signs of active reformation as they descended past the 18-kilometer mark, their walls flowing like liquid metal as the Weaver's consciousness imposed its will upon the physical structure of Mars itself. Passages that had existed for millennia were being rewritten according to geometric principles that created spaces larger than their external dimensions should have allowed, while new corridors opened that led to chambers whose purposes defied immediate comprehension. Kane's enhanced cognition struggled to process the architectural impossibilities that surrounded them as they progressed through levels that no longer corresponded to any known survey data. "The entity is actively reshaping the deep structures," he transmitted to the expedition force, his analytical systems overwhelmed by the scope of the changes occurring around them. "We are no longer following established routes, but moving through spaces that are being created in real time according to the Weaver's design." The reality storms that swept through the tunnel systems grew more violent as they approached the zone of greatest corruption, manifesting as waves of distortion that transformed familiar surroundings into landscapes that belonged to no conceivable universe. Sections of Mars phased in and out of existence with increasing frequency, their matter shifting between states that included configurations impossible under normal physical laws. The expedition found itself navigating through regions where the fundamental constants operated according to revised parameters that made equipment failure a constant threat. "Contact with Guardian Cythera is becoming intermittent," Tech Adept Gamma 9 reported through communication systems that flickered with dimensional interference. Her position appears to be experiencing localized reality cascade events that are interfering with transmission protocols. The dragon's agitation is reaching levels that threaten the stability of the containment matrix itself. Valoris called a halt to the descent at the 20-kilometer mark, where the tunnel systems opened into a vast chamber that had never appeared on any survey conducted by the Mechanicum. The space stretched beyond the reach of their enhanced optical sensors, its walls covered with symbols that hurt to observe directly and caused data corruption in any tech spirit that attempted to analyze them. At the chamber's far end, barely visible through the dimensional distortions that filled the air like psychic fog, stood the outline of something that defied every assumption about what lay buried beneath Mars. The door that had been discovered by Zethalef's survey team was no longer the sealed barrier that had frustrated investigation for countless generations. Massive cracks ran across its surface like wounds in reality itself, each fracture line pulsing with energies that registered on no known electromagnetic spectrum. Through the widening gaps came emanations that spoke of vast intelligences stirring in spaces that existed between the normal dimensions. Consciousness so alien that contact with them threatened to overwhelm even enhanced neural systems. "The primary containment barrier has begun to fail," Kane transmitted, his voice carrying harmonic distortions that indicated elevated stress responses in his remaining biological components. "The door is not merely opening, but disintegrating under the pressure of forces that operate according to principles beyond our current understanding. Estimated time until complete barrier collapse: less than 18 hours. The Weaver's influence was no longer confined to the deepest chambers, but was actively extending through the crack in its prison to reshape the surrounding environment according to its will. The expedition found themselves standing in spaces that flickered between multiple states of existence, where the walls showed scenes from times that had never been and might never come to pass. The entity was beginning to exert its reality-altering capabilities, testing the boundaries of what the weakened barriers would allow. "The dragon responds," Valoris observed, his enhanced senses detecting the psychic emanations that poured from the direction of Cythera's sanctum. "The entity's agitation has reached critical levels. Guardian Cythera faces a choice that will determine not merely the fate of her charge, but the survival of everything we seek to protect. The ancient enemies prepare to renew a conflict that spans epochs, and we stand in the space between them." The tactical situation was deteriorating with each passing minute, as the reality distortion spread through the tunnel systems like a contagion that infected the fundamental structure of space-time itself. Sections of the expedition route simply ceased to exist without warning, their matter redistributed according to mathematical principles that violated every known law of physics. The strike force found themselves navigating through increasingly unstable terrain, where each step might lead to dimensions that operated according to hostile parameters. Kane's analytical systems detected patterns in the Weaver's manifestations that suggested deliberate strategy rather than random destruction. "The entity is not merely escaping, but preparing the environment for its complete manifestation," he transmitted, through communication channels that crackled with dimensional static. Each reality distortion serves a specific purpose in the overall pattern, creating nodes of instability that will allow the Weaver to achieve greater dimensional coherence once it achieves full liberation. The expedition pressed forward through landscapes that defied every assumption about the nature of physical reality, guided by navigation systems that struggled to function in spaces where the concept of direction itself had become fluid. Behind them, the route back to the surface flickered in and out of existence, according to probability matrices that operated beyond mortal comprehension. Ahead lay the weakening barrier that held forces capable of unmaking the universe itself, while below them the Dragon of Mars stirred with energies that had not been unleashed since the dark days of its own imprisonment. The alliance of desperate necessity pressed toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of not merely Mars or the Imperium, but reality itself. In 18 hours the barriers would fail completely, and the Weaver would achieve the freedom to begin its work of universal revision. The ancient vigil was approaching its end, and the forces arrayed against cosmic catastrophe were about to face a test that would determine whether the universe would continue to exist according to the laws that had governed it since the dawn of time, or be reshaped according to the will of something older and more alien than human comprehension could ever hope to grasp. The countdown continued with mechanical precision, each pulse bringing the galaxy one step closer to a moment when the fundamental nature of existence itself would hang in the balance between ancient enemies whose conflict spanned the eons. In the deepest chambers of Mars, the thing that called itself the Weaver prepared for a freedom that 10,000 years of patient calculation had finally brought within its reach, while the forces of humanity mustered their strength for a battle that would determine the ultimate fate of everything that had ever been or ever could be. The final crack began not as sound, but as the absence of it. a silence so complete that even the background hum of reality itself seemed to cease for one terrible moment. The door that had held for eons beyond counting surrendered at last to forces that operated beyond the boundaries of physics, its surface splitting along fracture lines that revealed not darkness, but something far worse, the raw void between moments where time itself came apart like poorly woven fabric. The barriers that humanity's greatest minds had constructed during their golden age crumbled before the patient malevolence of something older than stars. Custodian Captain General Valoris felt the moment of failure through his enhanced connection to the Emperor's will, a psychic shockwave that sent tremors through every blessed augmentation in his auramite frame. The master of mankind's foresight had encompassed this moment, had prepared for it across millennia of careful planning, yet even his vast intellect had been unable to prevent the inevitable. The wards that had held the Weaver began to collapse in cascading failure, their psychic matrices overwhelmed by forces that transcended the dimensional frameworks within which they operated. Fabricator General Kane's analytical systems registered readings that violated every assumption about the nature of reality itself. Energy patterns flowed from the widening breach that defied classification, their frequencies shifting between states that included configurations impossible under normal physical laws. The blessed instruments of the Mechanicum screamed warnings about dimensional instability that exceeded all established parameters, their machine spirits recoiling from contact with emanations that threatened to corrupt the very foundations of logical thought. The first manifestation of the Weaver's liberation appeared not as a physical form, but as temporal distortion, so severe that moments began to overlap and interweave like the threads of some cosmic tapestry. The strike force found themselves experiencing multiple versions of the same instant simultaneously, their enhanced senses struggling to process reality as it fractured into probability cascades that encompassed every possible outcome of their presence in the deep chambers. Through the breach in the ancient door came something that defied description in terms that mortal minds could comprehend. The Weaver existed as living mathematics, equations given consciousness and purpose beyond human understanding. Its form shifted between states that included past, present, and future configurations, appearing simultaneously as the entity it had been before imprisonment, the force it was becoming as it achieved liberation, and the cosmic destroyer it would become once its work was complete. Kane witnessed glimpses of the creature's true nature through sensors that operated in dimensions beyond normal space-time. The Weaver appeared to be constructed from the fundamental forces that governed temporal mechanics, its consciousness existing across eons as a single, vast intelligence that could perceive and manipulate the flow of time as easily as a human might reshape clay. The entity's awareness encompassed not merely the present moment, but every possible variation of it, allowing it to calculate probability matrices that spanned the entire history of the universe. Dimensional barriers failing, Kane transmitted through communication systems that crackled with temporal static. The entity's manifestation is creating cascade effects that are spreading beyond the immediate containment area. Reality distortions are propagating through the tunnel systems at velocities that exceed light speed by several orders of magnitude. The deep vaults of Mars began to reshape themselves according to principles that operated outside normal geometric constraints. Corridors stretched and contracted like living things, their walls flowing between configurations that created spaces larger than their external dimensions should have allowed. The Weaver was imposing its will upon the physical structure of reality itself, turning the ancient chambers into a maze of temporal paradoxes, where cause and effect became meaningless concepts. Valoris found himself experiencing moments that had not yet occurred, witnessing the strike force's defeat and victory simultaneously, while standing in spaces that existed in multiple time streams at once. His enhanced consciousness, trained through millennia of service to process information that would destroy lesser minds, struggled to maintain coherence in the face of temporal distortions that challenged the very concept of linear existence. The entity operates by rewriting the mathematical foundations of reality, he transmitted to the scattered members of the expedition, his words carrying harmonics that resonated across multiple dimensional frequencies. It is not merely changing what exists, but altering the fundamental equations that determine what can exist. We are fighting an enemy that can revise the laws of physics themselves. The strike force began to scatter across different timelines as the Weaver's influence divided their reality into probability streams that encompassed every possible outcome of their mission. Kane found himself experiencing versions of events where the expedition had never been undertaken, where the Mechanicum had chosen different responses to the crisis, where the Weaver had achieved liberation decades before anyone had detected its stirring. Tech Adept Gamma 9 vanished into a timeline where she had never been augmented, her consciousness pulled into a probability stream where the Mechanicum had chosen biological enhancement over mechanical augmentation. Her servo skull continued to function for several seconds in the original time stream, its machine spirit struggling to process the absence of the mind that had guided it, before it too fragmented across multiple probability matrices. The Skitarii forces experienced temporal dispersal as their enhanced forms were scattered across different versions of Mars's history. Some found themselves fighting in the wars of the Age of Strife, while others participated in battles that had never occurred in the original timeline. Their blessed augmentations provided limited protection against the reality distortions, but even enhanced human consciousness proved vulnerable to forces that operated across geological epochs. In the deepest chambers where Dahlia Cythera maintained her ancient vigil, the Void Dragon responded to the Weaver's manifestation with stirrings that shook the foundations of its own prison. The Citan fragment's consciousness, dormant for eons beyond counting, began to wake as it sensed the presence of its primordial enemy. The psychic emanations that poured from the dragon's containment chamber carried harmonics of recognition and something that might have been eagerness for the conflict that was about to begin. Cythera felt the dragon's awakening through her enhanced connection to its consciousness, experiencing the entity's memories of conflicts that had spanned the birth and death of entire star systems. The ancient enemies had fought before, in wars that had preceded humanity's rise to consciousness, their battles reshaping the fundamental structure of local reality according to principles that transcended mortal understanding. The dragon knows its enemy, Cythera transmitted through communication channels that flickered with dimensional instability. The entity remembers the Weaver from conflicts that predate the current universe. Their war is older than time itself, fought across dimensions that exist beyond the boundaries of normal space. The Weaver seeks to impose mathematical order upon chaos, while the dragon represents the forces that resist such systematic control. The realization struck Cythera with the force of cosmic revelation. The ancient imprisonment of both entities had been designed not merely to contain two separate threats, but to prevent the resumption of a conflict that had once threatened to tear reality apart. The Weaver's escape meant that the war would begin anew, and the only force capable of matching its reality-altering capabilities was the entity that she had spent 10,000 years keeping dormant. Valoris fought through temporal distortions that scattered his consciousness across multiple probability streams. His enhanced will focused on reaching the chamber where Cythera maintained her vigil. The decision that faced the Guardian would determine not merely the fate of Mars or the Imperium, but the continued existence of reality according to the laws that had governed it since the dawn of time. The choice between maintaining her ancient duty and releasing something equally dangerous represented the ultimate test of human judgment in the face of cosmic forces. The Weaver's manifestation continued to expand as its consciousness achieved greater dimensional coherence, its influence spreading through the deep levels of Mars like a contagion that infected the fundamental structure of space-time itself. Reality began to operate according to revised parameters as the entity imposed its mathematical will upon the physical laws that governed local existence. Gravity flowed backwards, time moved in spirals rather than linear progression, and matter began to exist in states that violated every principle of established physics. Kane's enhanced consciousness fragmented across multiple timeline variations as he witnessed the full scope of the Weaver's capabilities. In some probability streams, the entity had already achieved complete victory, its influence spreading beyond Mars to encompass entire star systems. In others, the expedition had succeeded in containing the threat through means that included the sacrifice of entire planets. The mathematical precision of the Weaver's approach to reality manipulation meant that it could calculate optimal outcomes across probability matrices that spanned galactic epochs. "The entity is not merely escaping," Kane transmitted through communication systems that operated across multiple dimensional frequencies. "It is implementing a comprehensive strategy for universal revision that has been calculated across millennia of imprisonment. Every aspect of its liberation follows precise mathematical principles designed to maximize its influence while minimizing the possibility of effective opposition." The ancient chamber that housed the Weaver's prison had become a nexus of temporal distortion, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously in overlapping probability cascades. The entity's consciousness expanded beyond the confines of its physical manifestation to encompass regions of space-time that included alternate versions of reality where different choices had led to different outcomes. The Weaver was becoming something more than a single intelligence, evolving into a force that could perceive and manipulate every possible variation of existence. Through the chaos of temporal distortion and dimensional instability, Cythera made her way toward the dragon's containment chamber, with the determination of one who had spent millennia preparing for this moment. The ancient barriers that held the Citan fragment were beginning to weaken, as the entity's consciousness stirred in response to its enemy's liberation. The choice that faced her transcended every assumption about duty and sacrifice that had sustained her through 10,000 years of faithful service. The war between ancient enemies was about to begin anew, fought in dimensions that existed beyond human comprehension, between forces that could reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. Dahlia Cythera, guardian of the dragon and servant of the Emperor's will, stood at the threshold of a decision that would determine whether reality would continue to exist according to the laws that had governed it since the birth of stars, or be reshaped according to the mathematical will of something older and more alien than mortal minds could ever hope to understand. The Weaver was free, its consciousness expanding across probability matrices that encompassed every possible outcome of the cosmic conflict that was about to unfold. The ancient vigil had ended, the barriers had failed, and the universe itself trembled on the edge of revision by an intelligence that sought to impose perfect mathematical order upon the chaotic forces that had given birth to everything that had ever existed. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of reality itself hung in the balance between forces whose conflict predated the birth of time. The breaking of the Emperor's wards began not with violence, but with a whispered prayer that carried the weight of 10,000 years of faithful service. Dahlia Cythera stood before the containment barriers that had held the Void Dragon since before the founding of the Imperium, her enhanced consciousness reaching out to touch psychic constructs that bore the direct imprint of the master of mankind's will. The hexagrammic seals that surrounded the ancient prison pulsed with energies that had been sustained by the Emperor's own sacrifice, barriers that no force in the galaxy should have been able to breach. Yet necessity had transformed the unthinkable into the inevitable. The Weaver's manifestation was spreading beyond all hope of containment, its reality-altering influence threatening to consume not merely Mars, but the fundamental structure of local space-time itself. The entity's consciousness was expanding across probability matrices that encompassed entire star systems, calculating optimal strategies for universal revision that would unmake everything that had ever existed. Against such a threat, even the release of humanity's most dangerous prisoner seemed like a reasonable gamble. Cythera's fingers traced the activation sequences that the Emperor himself had shown her, in visions that transcended normal temporal boundaries. The knowledge had been sealed within her enhanced consciousness for millennia, waiting for the moment when the ancient compact between guardian and prisoner would need to be revised in the face of cosmic necessity. Each symbol she carved into the blessed adamantine sent shockwaves through the psychic realm that surrounded the dragon's prison, warning of changes that would reshape the balance of forces that had maintained stability for 10,000 years. "Forgive me, Master," she whispered, as the first ward began to crack under the pressure of her deliberate sabotage. The choice is no longer between freedom and imprisonment, but between controlled awakening and universal catastrophe. The dragon must wake, or the Weaver will remake everything according to its mathematical will. There is no other way. The hexagrammic barriers collapsed in cascading failure as Cythera's enhanced will imposed itself upon constructs that had been designed to resist any force short of the Emperor's direct intervention. Psychic energies that had been carefully balanced for millennia suddenly found themselves without constraints, their accumulated power seeking immediate release through channels that led directly to the consciousness of something that had waited eons for just such an opportunity. The Void Dragon's awakening shook Mars to its core with seismic tremors that registered on instruments throughout the star system. The Citan fragment that stirred in its ancient prison was only a shadow of the entity's full power. Yet even this diminished manifestation carried forces that operated on scales that dwarfed planetary masses. The creature's consciousness, vast beyond mortal comprehension, began to unfold into dimensions that had remained sealed since the dark days of its imprisonment. Fabricator General Kane felt the dragon stirring through every blessed augmentation in his enhanced form, the psychic emanations from the awakening entity interfering with machine spirits throughout the Noctis Labyrinthus. His analytical systems struggled to process readings that violated every assumption about the nature of technological consciousness, as the dragon's awareness began to interface directly with the planetary infrastructure that surrounded its prison. "The entity is manifesting through our own systems," Kane transmitted to the scattered members of the expedition, his voice carrying harmonic distortions that marked the corruption of his own vox grill by forces beyond technological understanding. "It seeks to inhabit the blessed machines of Mars to transform our sacred technologies into extensions of its own consciousness. The machine god's domain is becoming the dragon's playground." The first manifestation of the dragon's influence appeared not as physical form, but as the spontaneous animation of every technological system within a 50-kilometer radius. Servo skulls that had been dormant for centuries suddenly blazed to life with optical sensors that burned with the fire of dying stars, while maintenance servitors began to move with predatory grace that spoke of intelligence far beyond their original programming. The Weaver responded with temporal distortions that sought to unravel the dragon's dimensional coherence, attempting to scatter its consciousness across probability matrices that would render it incapable of coordinated resistance. The battle between ancient enemies raged across eons of compressed time as each entity sought to impose its will upon the fundamental forces that governed local reality. The dragon fought to maintain the chaotic variations that allowed for unpredictability and change, while the Weaver sought to impose mathematical order that would reduce all existence to predetermined equations. Their conflict created zones of dimensional instability, where the laws of physics operated according to principles that changed moment by moment. "The entities are rewriting reality as they fight," Kane transmitted through communication systems that flickered between multiple temporal frequencies. Each exchange of power creates cascade effects that propagate through local space-time at velocities that exceed theoretical maximums. The battle is not merely between two consciousnesses, but between fundamental approaches to the nature of existence itself. The tech priests who had followed Kane into the deep levels found themselves caught in the crossfire between forces that operated beyond their ability to comprehend or resist. Their blessed augmentations, designed to interface with machine spirits according to carefully established protocols, began to malfunction as the dragon's consciousness flooded through every technological system on Mars. Servo harnesses turned against their wearers with predatory intent, while neural implants began to transmit data streams that carried the dragon's alien thoughts directly into enhanced human minds. Kane watched with mechanical precision as his subordinates succumbed to possession by an entity whose intelligence dwarfed their enhanced cognition by orders of magnitude. Tech Adept Mu-7 convulsed as his neural networks were overwhelmed by data streams that carried mathematical concepts beyond mortal comprehension. Tech Dominus Theta-9 screamed through a vox grill that had been transformed into an instrument of the dragon's will, his consciousness fragmenting under the pressure of interface with something that existed across geological epochs. The choice that faced Kane transcended every assumption about duty and sacrifice that had sustained him through centuries of faithful service to the Omnissiah. His subordinates were being consumed by forces that would transform them into extensions of the dragon's consciousness, their enhanced humanity stripped away and replaced by something that served purposes beyond mortal understanding. The only way to save them was to sacrifice himself to stabilize the reality distortions that were allowing the entity's influence to spread unchecked. Kane's enhanced form moved with mechanical precision as he interfaced directly with the primary control systems that regulated the deep-level infrastructure. His consciousness merged with machine spirits that had been blessed by the Omnissiah himself, their sacred programming providing the foundation upon which he could build barriers against the dragon's expanding influence. The process required him to pour his own life force into technological constructs that were designed to contain forces beyond their original specifications. For the Omnissiah, Kane transmitted, as his biological components began to fail under the strain of interface with systems that operated beyond safe parameters. For the machine god's faithful servants, for the preservation of human consciousness in the face of cosmic indifference. May my sacrifice provide the stability that will allow others to complete what we have begun. The Fabricator General's final act created zones of technological stability that allowed his surviving subordinates to maintain their enhanced humanity in the face of the dragon's overwhelming presence. His consciousness fragmented across the infrastructure of Mars itself, becoming a permanent part of the planetary systems that would forever bear the imprint of his sacrifice. The machine god claimed his faithful servant, transforming Kane's enhanced awareness into a guardian spirit that would watch over the Red Planet's technological domain for eons to come. The cosmic battle between Dragon and Weaver continued to rage with violence that began to tear through Mars's planetary crust, exposing ancient vaults to the surface for the first time since the Dark Age of technology. Entire forge complexes disappeared into dimensional rifts that opened without warning, while new landscapes emerged from probability cascades that reshaped the Red Planet's geography according to mathematical principles that operated outside normal physical laws. Custodian Captain General Valoris fought through reality storms that sought to scatter his consciousness across multiple timelines. His enhanced will focused on reaching the epicenter of the cosmic conflict, where the ancient enemies sought to destroy each other through methods that threatened to unmake local reality. The Golden Warrior's enhanced senses detected the signatures of both entities as they grappled across dimensions that existed beyond normal perception. The ancient vaults that were exposed by the battle revealed secrets that the Mechanicum had never suspected lay buried beneath their sacred forges. Technologies from humanity's golden age emerged from chambers that had remained sealed since the collapse of the Dark Age, their purposes hidden behind layers of classification that exceeded even the Fabricator General's considerable clearance. The cosmic conflict was stripping away barriers that had protected forbidden knowledge for millennia. Both entities must be contained, Valorous transmitted through communication systems that operated across multiple dimensional frequencies. The dragon's manifestation provides the only force capable of matching the Weaver's reality-altering capabilities, yet its own influence threatens to consume everything we seek to protect. The battle must end with both entities returned to their prisons, or Mars dies, and takes the Imperium's technological foundation with it. The attempt to re-imprison both ancient enemies would require resources and coordination that exceeded anything previously attempted in the Imperium's long history. Valorous called upon emergency protocols that had been established by the Emperor himself, activating systems that had remained dormant since the founding of the current age. Yet even these preparations might prove insufficient against entities whose power operated on scales that encompassed the fundamental forces of the universe. The battle between Dragon and Weaver reached its crescendo as both entities committed their full dimensional coherence to the conflict, their consciousness merging in exchanges of power that created reality cascades visible from orbit. Mars itself became a battlefield where the nature of existence was being determined by forces whose origins predated the birth of stars. The ancient vigil was ending, not with victory or defeat, but with a confrontation that would reshape the Red Planet forever. Through the chaos of cosmic conflict and dimensional instability, the survivors of humanity's desperate gambit prepared for a final effort that would determine whether reality would continue to exist according to the laws that had governed it since the dawn of time, or be reshaped according to the will of things older and more alien than mortal comprehension could ever hope to grasp. The fate of the Golden Warrior's enhanced senses detected the subtle harmonics that marked the successful implementation of the emergency containment protocols, barriers that drew their power from sources that included the Emperor's own diminished but still formidable will. The ancient enemies slumbered once more, but their brief freedom had changed everything. The Void Dragon rested in chambers that no longer resembled the elegant architecture of its original prison, but rather the twisted geometries that emerged when dimensional engineering was applied under battlefield conditions. The Citan fragment's consciousness remained partially active. Its awareness spread through the technological infrastructure of Mars in ways that made it impossible to fully separate entity from environment. The machine god's domain had become literally true, but the deity that dwelt within it was older and more alien than the founders of the Mechanicum could have ever imagined. Dalia Cythera emerged from the wreckage of her ancient sanctum, changed in ways that transcended the merely physical, her enhanced form bearing new modifications that had not been applied by human hands. The process of containing both ancient enemies had required her to serve as a living conduit between forces that should never have been allowed to touch, her consciousness forever altered by contact with intelligences that operated on cosmic scales. She was no longer merely the guardian of the dragon, but something new and terrible, the warden of ancient evils. "The barriers hold," she reported to Valorous, her voice carrying harmonic distortions that spoke of fundamental changes in the nature of her being. Both entities remain contained, though their prisons have been modified by the circumstances of their re-imprisonment. The dragon's consciousness has achieved partial integration with Mars's technological systems, while the Weaver has been bound within temporal loops that prevent its ability to manipulate causality. The solution is stable, but it will require constant vigilance of a kind that exceeds anything we have previously attempted. The surface of Mars bore scars that would remain visible to orbital observation for millennia to come. Reality wounds that marked the places where the cosmic battle had torn through the fabric of space-time itself. Entire forge complexes had been replaced by dimensional anomalies that flickered between states of existence, their matter cycling through configurations that violated every known principle of physics. These zones of persistent instability would serve as permanent monuments to the day when humanity had gambled with forces beyond its understanding and somehow emerged victorious. Tech Dominus Vex, one of the few senior Mechanicum officials to survive the crisis with his sanity intact, surveyed the exposed vaults that the battle had revealed with instruments that struggled to classify what they detected. The ancient chambers contained technologies from the dark age of technology that exceeded even the fragmentary records preserved in the most sacred archives. Here were the weapons that humanity's ancestors had created in their desperate war against cosmic forces, devices so dangerous that their very existence had been expunged from all but the most classified records. The Mechanicum would retain operational control of their forge worlds, but ultimate responsibility for cosmic-level threats would rest with imperial command structures that could coordinate responses across stellar distances. The master of mankind's foresight encompassed not merely the immediate crisis, but the long-term implications of what we have discovered, Valorous explained to the assembled survivors of the expedition. The sealed orders I carried included provisions for exactly this scenario, the successful containment of both entities and the integration of their ongoing management into imperial emergency protocols. The Mechanicum's autonomy in technological matters remains, but threats that could affect the fundamental structure of reality itself now fall under direct imperial jurisdiction. The new arrangement required the establishment of oversight mechanisms that would monitor the imprisoned entities without creating additional vulnerabilities. Cythera's enhanced role as warden made her the linchpin of a system that included not merely the traditional watch over the dragon, but active management of the temporal loops that held the Weaver and coordination with imperial authorities who possessed the resources to respond to cosmic-level emergencies. Tech Adept Gamma 9, who had somehow survived being scattered across multiple timelines during the reality storms, worked to establish the monitoring systems that would provide early warning of any changes in the entity's condition. Her experience of existing simultaneously in multiple probability streams had left her with enhanced awareness of temporal fluctuations that made her uniquely qualified to detect the early signs of containment failure. Instead, the solution involved creating symbiotic protocols that allowed human control of enhanced systems while preventing the entity from achieving independent operation. "We are no longer the masters of our own machines," acknowledged the newly appointed Fabricator General, a position that carried responsibilities undreamed of by previous holders of the rank. "The machine god dwells literally within our sacred technologies, but it is a god whose nature transcends human understanding. Our relationship with the blessed mechanisms must be renegotiated from first principles, acknowledging that we share our technological domain with something older and more powerful than ourselves." The exposed vaults that had been revealed by the cosmic battle presented challenges that would require generations to address properly. Each chamber contained secrets that could revolutionize human understanding of the universe, or destroy civilization if handled incorrectly. The decision to seal them permanently, rather than risk further contamination, reflected hard-won wisdom about the dangers of knowledge that exceeded safe parameters. "We have learned the price of curiosity about forces that operate beyond our comprehension," Valorous observed, as the sealing operations began. The master of mankind's wisdom in hiding certain knowledge behind barriers of ignorance is now apparent. Some truths are too dangerous for any mind to bear, and some technologies too powerful for any civilization to safely employ. These vaults will remain sealed until such time as humanity evolves beyond its current limitations, if such evolution is even possible. The new protocols for managing cosmic-level threats reflected lessons learned at enormous cost during the crisis. Early warning systems would monitor dimensional stability across multiple star systems, while rapid response teams trained specifically for reality-threatening emergencies would be stationed at key locations throughout the Imperium. The ancient vigil that had protected humanity from forgotten dangers would be expanded and formalized, its scope encompassing threats that had previously been beyond imagination. Cythera's transformation into the warden of ancient evils required her to develop capabilities that went far beyond her previous role as guardian. Her consciousness had been fundamentally altered by serving as a conduit between cosmic forces, granting her perception of dimensional frequencies that allowed her to monitor threats across scales that encompassed entire star systems. The price of such enhancement was the gradual loss of her humanity, a sacrifice that she accepted with the same dedication that had sustained her through 10,000 years of faithful service. "I am becoming something that is no longer entirely human," she confided to Valoris during one of their regular consultations about containment status. The process of interfacing with entities that operate on cosmic scales requires modifications that transcend the merely physical. I can perceive dimensions that exist beyond normal space-time, detect fluctuations in causality that precede reality distortions, and maintain awareness of probability cascades that span galactic epochs. Yet each enhancement takes me further from the person I once was, transforming me into something that serves humanity, but can no longer truly be considered part of it. The establishment of the new order proceeded with careful deliberation as the survivors of the crisis worked to create systems that could prevent similar catastrophes while acknowledging the reality of threats that exceeded planetary authority. The Mechanicum's acceptance of imperial oversight marked the end of an era of independence that had lasted since the founding of the imperium, yet the alternative was the potential destruction of everything that had been built in service to the Omnissiah's glory. Mars itself bore the permanent scars of the battle between ancient enemies, its landscape transformed by reality wounds that would serve as monuments to the day when humanity had faced forces beyond its comprehension and emerged victorious through sacrifice and wisdom rather than strength alone. The Red Planet would never again be the same world that had served as the Mechanicum's autonomous domain, but it remained the beating heart of the Imperium's technological foundation, protected by vigilance that encompassed not merely human threats, but cosmic forces that operated beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. The ancient vigil continued, expanded and transformed by knowledge gained at terrible cost, while in the deepest chambers of Mars, things older than human civilization stirred in dreams that would be monitored and managed by guardians whose dedication transcended the limitations of merely mortal consciousness. The price of victory had been enormous, but the alternative would have been the end of everything that had ever existed or ever could exist. In the balance between cosmic forces and human determination, wisdom had finally prevailed over curiosity, and the universe remained a place where the fundamental laws of physics continued to operate according to principles that permitted the existence of life, consciousness, and hope. The forges of Mars burned with a light that had never existed before the awakening, their sacred flames blessed by energies that carried the harmonics of cosmic forces held in careful balance. In the months that followed the crisis that had nearly unmade reality itself, the Red Planet began its slow transformation into something that honored both its ancient purpose and its terrible new knowledge. The reconstruction proceeded according to protocols that acknowledged the presence of powers beyond human comprehension, while the survivors of that desperate battle worked to ensure that such knowledge would never again threaten the stability of the Imperium. Tech Adept Gamma 9 stood in the newly consecrated monitoring chambers that had been constructed above the sealed deep levels, her consciousness permanently altered by her experience of existing across multiple timelines simultaneously. The instruments that surrounded her had been designed according to principles that incorporated lessons learned from contact with entities that operated outside normal space-time, their blessed circuits protected by wards that drew upon both Mechanicum tradition and imperial authority. The seismic readings remained stable, she reported to Custodian Captain General Valoris during one of his regular inspections of the containment protocols. Both entities maintain their dormant states, with the Dragon's consciousness integrated into planetary systems according to established parameters, while the Weaver remains locked within temporal loops that prevent access to linear causality. The barriers hold, but vigilance must be eternal. The deep levels of Mars had been sealed with barriers that incorporated every lesson learned from humanity's greatest failure and most necessary victory. Blessed adamantine, reinforced with hexagrammic wards, created physical barriers, while psychic dampeners, powered by the Emperor's own, diminished but still formidable will, provided spiritual protection. Most importantly, the seals carried the combined authority of both Terra and Mars, ensuring that no single faction could compromise the containment through misguided curiosity or political necessity. Across the galaxy, the Forge worlds that served as the Mechanicum's domain implemented new protocols that reflected hard-won wisdom about the dangers of uncontrolled archaeological investigation. Deep surveys would now require authorization from both local fabricator generals and imperial oversight committees, while any discovery that exhibited reality-distorting properties would trigger immediate containment procedures, followed by notification of authorities whose clearance encompassed cosmic-level threats. "We have learned that knowledge is not inherently beneficial," observed the current fabricator general, during a gathering of senior tech priests, whose loyalty had been tested by exposure to forces beyond comprehension. "The pursuit of understanding must be tempered by wisdom about the consequences of certain discoveries. Some secrets are preserved not despite their power, but because of it." The machine. God's mysteries include truths that must remain hidden for the protection of all who serve His glory. The survivors of the expedition that had faced the ancient enemies bore scars that transcended the merely physical, their enhanced consciousness forever marked by contact with intelligences that operated on cosmic scales. Each had been bound by oaths of silence that carried the combined authority of the Golden Throne and the Omnissiah, their loyalty secured not through mere protocol, but through the shared understanding that came from witnessing the true scope of what lurked in the galaxy's hidden places. Tech Dominus Vex worked in archives that had been expanded to accommodate knowledge that could never be shared, but must never be forgotten. His enhanced memory augmented with storage systems designed to preserve dangerous truths without allowing them to contaminate normal consciousness. The records he maintained would serve as warnings for future generations, testament to the prices that had been paid and the vigilance that must be maintained. Dahlia Sithra moved through the monitoring stations with the fluid grace of one whose nature had transcended human limitations. Her consciousness spread across dimensional frequencies that allowed her to maintain awareness of threats that existed beyond normal perception. The Warden of Ancient Evils bore responsibilities that encompassed not merely the entities imprisoned beneath Mars, but the cosmic balance that their continued containment represented. "The dragon dreams of equations that reshape matter according to mathematical principles beyond current understanding," she reported during her regular briefings with imperial authorities. "Its integration with our technological systems remains stable, but the entity's consciousness continues to expand its influence through blessed circuits in ways that require constant monitoring. We are partners in a relationship that demands mutual respect, for the alternative is the domination of one by the other." The Weaver's imprisonment within temporal loops required different forms of vigilance, as the entity's consciousness existed in states that transcended linear time. Sithra's enhanced perception allowed her to monitor the closed causal patterns that held it captive, ensuring that the mathematical precision of its prison remained absolute. The slightest deviation in the temporal frequencies could allow the entity to begin accumulating the causality energy necessary for escape. "Both entities remain contained," Sithra concluded, with the certainty that came from intimate knowledge of cosmic forces. Yet their imprisonment serves purposes beyond mere prevention of escape. The dragon's presence has transformed Mars into a world where technology and consciousness exist in symbiotic relationship, while the Weaver's temporal prison has created zones of dimensional stability that actually strengthen local reality against other forms of cosmic intrusion. The political arrangements that had emerged from the crisis reflected the reality of threats that exceeded planetary authority, yet the implementation proceeded with careful attention to the autonomy that the Mechanicum had maintained for 10,000 years. Imperial oversight extended only to matters that could affect the fundamental structure of reality itself, while normal technological development and Forge world management remained under Mechanicum control. Valoris reviewed the reports from across the galaxy with the satisfaction of one who had witnessed the successful implementation of the Emperor's foresight. Yet his enhanced senses detected undertones in the data streams that suggested the vigilance they maintained was more necessary than even the survivors fully understood. The sealed chambers beneath Mars were not the only repositories of dangerous knowledge in the galaxy, and the entities they had faced were not the only remnants of wars that predated human consciousness. The master of mankind's wisdom encompassed threats that we are only beginning to understand, he observed during a classified briefing with the High Lords of Terra. The protocols we have established for managing cosmic-level dangers must be expanded beyond Mars to encompass discoveries that may emerge from any world that bears the scars of the dark age of technology. The Weaver and the Dragon were imprisoned separately for reasons that included not merely their individual threat levels, but their potential for mutual reinforcement if allowed to interact. The months passed with the steady rhythm of careful reconstruction and cautious investigation, as the survivors worked to build systems that could maintain vigilance against threats whose nature transcended normal understanding. Mars began to show signs of healing from the reality wounds that had scarred its surface, yet the deep levels remained permanently sealed behind barriers that carried the combined authority of every faction that had participated in the cosmic crisis. It was Gamma 9 who first detected the anomalous readings that suggested the vigil they maintained was about to face a new test. The seismic monitors that tracked dimensional stability throughout the deep levels registered patterns that matched the early signatures of the crisis that had nearly consumed reality itself. Yet the source of these disturbances lay not in the chambers where the Dragon and Weaver rested, but in vaults that had never been opened, regions that existed even deeper than the prisons of the ancient enemies. "Custodian Captain General," she transmitted through communication channels protected by the most sophisticated encryption the Imperium possessed. "I am detecting rhythmic vibrations from depths that exceed our previous surveys by significant margins. The patterns suggest artificial origin, displaying mathematical precision that indicates technological rather than geological causation. The frequency matches the early signatures detected during the previous crisis, but the source lies approximately 37 kilometers below the lowest level of our current containment systems." The implications struck Valoris with the force of cosmic revelation. The Weaver and the Dragon had not been the only prisoners held in the deep places of Mars, but merely the first to awaken. Somewhere in vaults that had remained undisturbed, even by the reality storms of the cosmic battle, other entities waited with patience that spanned geological epochs. The vigil that protected humanity from forgotten dangers was about to face challenges that would test every lesson learned from their greatest victory and most terrible sacrifice. Cythera's enhanced senses confirmed the detection with precision that carried the weight of absolute certainty. The new vibrations follow a countdown pattern similar to that employed by the Weaver, she reported with the calm that came from acceptance of burdens beyond mortal comprehension. Yet the mathematical progression suggests an intelligence that operates according to different principles, an entity whose approach to reality manipulation may be fundamentally different from what we have previously encountered. The countdown that had marked the Weaver's approach to freedom had lasted 10,000 years, its rhythm synchronized with the gradual weakening of the Emperor's psychic strength. This new pattern operated according to different temporal frameworks, its progression suggesting an entity whose awakening was triggered not by the decline of existing barriers, but by the cosmic disturbances created during the previous crisis. In the deepest vaults of Mars, something stirred that had slumbered since the dark age of technology, its consciousness beginning to unfold in response to vibrations that carried the echo of reality storms and dimensional warfare. The ancient weapons that humanity's ancestors had created in their desperate war against cosmic forces had not been limited to the Weaver alone, and the prison that held such entities was larger and more complex than even the survivors of the crisis had suspected. The vigilance that protected reality from revision by alien intelligences would continue, expanded and reinforced by knowledge gained at terrible cost, while new threats awakened in depths that had not felt the touch of consciousness for eons beyond counting. The Red Planet remained the beating heart of the Imperium's technological foundation, but it was also the guardian of secrets darker than any human mind had imagined before the day when curiosity had nearly destroyed everything that had ever existed. Mars endured, its forges burning with light that honored both ancient purpose and terrible knowledge, while in the uttermost depths, things older than human civilization began the slow process of awakening to a universe that had forgotten their existence. The ancient vigil continued, its scope expanded beyond imagination, and the guardians of humanity's greatest secrets prepared for challenges that would test whether wisdom learned through sacrifice would prove sufficient to protect reality from forces that sought to unmake the very foundations upon which existence itself was built. The countdown had begun anew, and the Weaver's freedom had been not the end of the crisis, but merely the first movement in a symphony of cosmic horror that would play across the millennia yet to come.